Section 33 of Captains of Industry. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Tomcho. Captains of Industry by James Parton, Section 33. George Hope. The story of this stalwart and skillful Scotch farmer, George Hope, enables us to understand what agitators mean by the term landlordism. It is a very striking case, as the reader will admit. George Hope, born in 1811, was the son of a tenant farmer of the county of East Lothian, now represented in Parliament by Mr. Gladstone. The farm on which he was born, on which his ancestors had lived, and upon which he spent the greater part of his own life, was called Fenton Barns. With other lands adjacent, it made a farm of about 800 acres. Two-thirds of it were of a stiff, retentive clay, extremely hard to work, and the rest was little better than sand, of a yellow color and incapable of producing grain. 2 or 3 generations of Hopes had spent life and toil unspeakable upon this unproductive tract, without making the least profit by it, being just able to pay their rent and keep their heads above water. They subsisted, reared families, and died, worn out with hard work, leaving to their sons, besides an honest name, only the same inheritance of struggle and despair. George Hope's mother tried for years to squeeze out of her butter and eggs the price of a table large enough for all her family to sit round at once, but died without obtaining it. At the age of 18 years, George Hope took hold of this unpromising farm, his parents being in declining health, nearly exhausted by their long struggle with it. He brought to his task an intelligent and cultivated mind. He had been for 4 years in a lawyer's office. He had read with great admiration the writings of the American Channing, and he now used his intelligence in putting new life into this old land. The first thing was to acquire more capital, and the only way of accomplishing this was to do much of the work himself. Mere manual labor, however, would not have sufficed, for he found himself baffled by the soil. Part of the land being wet, cold clay and part yellow sand, he improved both by mixing them together. He spread sand upon his clay, and clay upon his sand, as well as abundant manure, and he established a kiln for converting some of the clay into tiles, with which he drained his own farm, besides selling large quantities of tiles to the neighboring farmers. For a time he was in the habit of burning a kiln of 11,000 tiles every week, and he was thus enabled to expend in draining his own farms about $13,000 without going in debt for it. He believed in what is called high farming, and spent enormous sums in fertilizing the soil. For a mere top dressing of guano, bones, nitrate of soda, or sulfate of ammonia, he spent one spring $8,000. These large expenditures, directed as they were by a man who thoroughly understood his business, produced wonderful results. He gained a large fortune, and his farm became so celebrated that travelers arrived from all parts of Europe, and even from the United States, to see it. An American called one day to inspect the farm, when Mr. Hope began, as usual, to express his warm admiration for Dr. Channing. The visitor was a nephew of the distinguished preacher, and he was exceedingly surprised to find his uncle so keenly appreciated in that remote spot. It is difficult to say which of his 2 kinds of land improved the most under his vigorous treatment. His sandy soil, the crop of which in former years was sometimes blown out of the ground, was so strengthened by its dressing of clay as to produce excellent crops of wheat, and his clay fields were made among the most productive in Scotland by his system of combined sanding, draining, and fertilizing. One of his secrets was that he treated his laborers with justice and consideration. His harvest homes were famous in their day. When he found that certain old-fashioned games caused some of his weak teetotalers to fall from grace, he changed them for others, and instead of beer and toddy, provided abundance of tea, coffee, strawberries, and other dainties. When the time came for dancing, he took the lead, and could sometimes boast that he had not missed one dance the whole evening. In addressing a public meeting of farmers and landlords in 1861, he spoke on the subject of improving the cottages of farm laborers. These were some of the sentences which fell from his lips: "Treat your laborers with respect as men. Encourage their self-respect. Never enter a poor man's house any more than a rich man's unless invited, and then go not to find fault, but as a friend. If you can render him or his family a service, by advice or otherwise, let it be more delicately done than to your most intimate associate. Remember how hard it is for a poor man to respect himself. He hears the wealthy styled the respectable, and the poor the lower classes. But never call a man low. His being a man dwarfs and renders as nothing all the distinctions of an earthly estate." The reader sees what kind of person this George Hope was. He was as nearly a perfect character as our very imperfect race can ordinarily exhibit. He was a great farmer, a true captain of industry, an honest, intelligent, just, and benevolent man. He was, moreover, a good citizen, and this led him to take an interest in public matters, and to do his utmost in aid of several reasonable reforms. He was what is called a liberal in politics. He did what he could to promote the Reform Bill of Lord John Russell, and he was a conspicuous ally of Cobden and Bright in their efforts to break down the old Corn Laws. He remembered that there were about 5,000 convictions in Great Britain every year under the game laws, and he strove in all moderate and proper ways to have those laws repealed. And now we come to the point. A certain person named R.A. Dundas Christopher Nisbet Hamilton married the heiress of the estate to which the farm of George Hope belonged. He thus acquired the power, when a tenant's house expired, to refuse a renewal. This person was a Tory, who delighted in the slaughter of birds and beasts, and who thought it highly impertinent in the tenant of a farm to express political opinions contrary to those of his landlord. George Hope, toward the end of his long lease, offered to take the farm again, at a higher rent than he had ever before paid, though it was himself who had made the farm more valuable. His offer was coldly declined, and he was obliged, after expending the labor and skill of 53 years upon that land, to leave it, and find another home for his old age. He had fortunately made money enough to buy a very good farm for himself, and he had often said that he would rather farm 50 acres of his own than to be the tenant of the best farm in Europe. This eviction, as it was called, of a farmer so celebrated attracted universal comment, and excited general indignation. He left his farm like a conqueror. Public dinners and services of plate were presented to him, and his landlord of many names acquired a notoriety throughout Europe which no doubt he enjoyed. He certainly did a very bold action, and one which casts a perfect glare of light upon the nature of landlordism. George Hope died in 1876, universally honored in Scotland. He lies buried in the parish of his old farm, not far from the home of his fathers. On his tombstone is inscribed, "To the memory of George Hope, for many years tenant of Fenton Barns. He was the devoted supporter of every movement which tended to the advancement of civil and religious liberty, and to the moral and social elevation of mankind." End of Section 33. Recording by William Tomcho.
Section 34 of Captains of Industry. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julia Kelley. Captains of Industry by James Parton. Section 34. Sir Henry Cole. He was an old public functionary in the service of the British people. When President Buchanan spoke of himself as an old public functionary, he was a good deal laughed at by some of the newspapers, and the phrase has since been frequently used in an opprobrious or satirical sense. This is to be regretted, for there is no character more respectable, and there are few so useful, as an intelligent and patriotic man of long standing in the public service. What one such man can do is shown by the example of Sir Henry Cole, who died a few months ago in London after half a century of public life. The son of an officer in the British Army, he was educated at that famous Blue Coat School, which is interesting to Americans because Lamb and Coleridge attended it. At the age of 15 he received an appointment as clerk in the Office of Public Records. In due time, having proved his capacity and peculiar fitness, he was promoted to the post of assistant keeper, which gave him a respectable position and some leisure. He proved to be, in an eminent sense, the right man in the right place. Besides publishing from time to time curious and interesting documents which he discovered in his office, he called attention by a series of vigorous pamphlets to the chaotic condition in which the public records of Great Britain were kept. Gradually these pamphlets made an impression, and they led at length to a reform in the office. The records were rearranged, catalogued, rendered safe, and made accessible to students. This has already led to important corrections in history, and to a great increase in the sum of historical knowledge. When the subject of cheap postage came up in 1840, the government offered 4 prizes of £100 each for suggestions in aid of Sir Rowland Hill's plan. One of these prizes was assigned to Henry Cole. He was one of the persons who first became converts to the idea of penny postage, and he lent the aid of his pen and influence to its adoption. At length, about the year 1845, he entered upon the course of proceedings which rendered him one of the most influential and useful persons of his time. He had long lamented the backward condition of arts of design in England, and the consequent ugliness of the various objects in the sight and use of which human beings pass their lives: English furniture, wallpapers, carpets, curtains, cutlery, garments, upholstery, ranged from the tolerable to the hideous, and were inferior to the manufactures of France and Germany. He organized a series of exhibitions on a small scale, somewhat similar to those of the American Institute in New York, which has held a competitive exhibition of natural and manufactured objects every autumn for the last 50 years. His exhibitions attracted attention, and they led at length to the Crystal Palace exhibition of 1851. The merit of that scheme must be shared between Henry Cole and Prince Albert. Cole suggested that his small exhibitions should, once in 5 years, assume a national character, and invite contributions from all parts of the empire. "Yes," said Prince Albert, "and let us also invite competition from foreign countries on equal terms with native products." The exhibition of 1851 was admirably managed, and had every kind of success. It benefited England more than all other nations put together, because it revealed to her people their inferiority in many branches, both of workmanship and design. We all know how conceited people are apt to become who have no opportunity to compare themselves with superiors. John Bull, never over-modest, surveyed the exhibition of 1851, and discovered to his great surprise that he was not the unapproachable bull of the universe, which he had fondly supposed. He saw himself beaten in some things by the French, in some by the Germans, in others by the Italians, and in a few, oh wonder, by the Yankees. Happily he had the candor to admit this humiliating fact to himself, and he put forth earnest and steadfast exertions to bring himself up to the level of modern times. Henry Cole was the life and soul of the movement. It was he who called attention to the obstacles placed in the way of improvement by the patent laws, and some of those obstacles through him were speedily removed. During this series of services to his country, he remained in the office of public records. The government now invited him to another sphere of labor. They asked him to undertake the reconstruction of the schools of design, and they gave him an office which placed him practically at the head of the various institutions designed to promote the application of art to manufacture. The chief of these now is the Museum of South Kensington, which is to many Americans the most interesting object in London. The creation of this wonderful museum was due more to him than to any other individual. It came to pass in this way. After the close of the Crystal Palace in 1851, Parliament gave £5,000 for the purchase of the objects exhibited, which were thought best calculated to raise the standard of taste in the nation. These objects, chiefly selected by Cole, were arranged by him for exhibition in temporary buildings of such extreme and repulsive inconvenience as to bring opprobrium and ridicule upon the undertaking. It was one of the most difficult things in the world to excite public interest in the exhibition, but by that energy which comes of strong conviction and patriotic feeling, and of the opportunity given him by his public employment, Henry Cole wrung from a reluctant Parliament the annual grants necessary to make South Kensington Museum what it now is. Magnificent buildings, filled with a vast collection of precious and interesting objects, greet the visitor. There are collections of armor, relics, porcelain, enamel, fabrics, paintings, statues, carvings in wood and ivory, machines, models, and every conceivable object of use or beauty. Some of the most celebrated pictures in the world are there, and there is an art library of 30,000 volumes. There are schools for instruction in every branch of art and science which can be supposed to enter into the products of industry. The prizes which are offered for excellence in design and invention have attracted in some years as many as 200,000 objects. During 3 days of every week, admission to this superb assemblage of exhibitions is free, and on the other 3 days, 6d. is charged. The influence of this institution upon British manufactures has been in many branches revolutionary. As the London Times said some time ago, there is hardly a household in the country that is not the better for the change. There is certainly no manufacture in which design has any place which has not felt its influence. The formation of this museum, the chief work of Sir Henry Cole's useful life, was far from exhausting his energies. He has borne a leading part in all the industrial exhibitions held in London during the last quarter of a century, and served as English commissioner at the Paris exhibitions of 1855 and 1867. This man was enabled to render all this service to his country, to Europe, and to us, because he was not obliged to waste any of his energies in efforts to keep his place. Administrations might change, and parliaments might dissolve, but he was a fixture as long as he did his duty. When his duty was fairly done, and he had completed the 40th year of his public service, he retired on full salary, and he was granted an honorable title. For a title is honorable when it is won by good service. Henceforth he was called Sir Henry Cole, K.C.B. To the end of his life he continued to labour in all sorts of good works, a training school for music, a training school for cookery, guilds for the promotion of health, and many others. He died in April 1882, aged 74 years. End of section 34. Recording by Julia Kelley, Knoxville, Tennessee, USA.
Section 35 of Captains of Industry. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Theresa Sheridan. Captains of Industry by James Parton. Section 35. Charles Summers. Strangers visiting Melbourne, the chief city of Australia, will not be allowed to overlook 4 great marble statues which adorn the public library. They are the gift of Mr. W. J. Clark, one of the distinguished public men of that growing empire. These statues represent, in a sitting posture, Queen Victoria, Prince Albert, the Prince of Wales, and the Princess of Wales. They are larger than life, and according to the Australian press, they are admirable works in every respect. They were executed by Charles Summers, a sculptor long resident in that colony, where he practiced his art with great success, as the public buildings and private houses of Melbourne attest. Many of his works remain in the colony, and he may be said to be the founder of his form of art in that part of the world. The history of this man's life is so remarkable that I think it will interest the reader. 60 years ago, Charles Summers was a little, hungry, ragged boy in English Somersetshire, who earned 4 cents a day by scaring the crows from the wheat fields. I have seen myself such little fellows, engaged in this work, coming on duty before 4 in the morning, and remaining till 8 in the evening, frightening away the birds by beating a tin pan with a stick, not unfrequently chasing them and throwing stones at them. He was the son of a mason who had 8 children, and squandered half his time and money in the tap room. Hence this boy, from the age of 8 or 9 years, smart, intelligent, and ambitious, was constantly at work at some such employment, and often during his father's drunken fits he was the chief support of the family. Besides serving as scarecrow, he assisted his father in his mason's work, and became a hod carrier as soon as he was able to carry a hod. Sometimes he accompanied his father to a distant place in search of employment, and he was often seen on the high road, in charge of the drunkard, struggling to get him home before he had spent their united earnings in drink. In these deplorable circumstances he acquired a dexterity and patience which were most extraordinary. Before he was 12 years old he began to handle the chisel and the mallet, and his work in squaring and facing a stone soon surpassed that of boys much older than himself. He was observed to have a strong propensity to do fancy stonework. He obtained as a boy some local celebrity for his carved gate-posts and other ornamental objects in stone. So great was his skill and industry that by the time he was 19 years of age, besides having maintained a large family for years, he had saved a sum equal to $100. Then a piece of good fortune happened to him. A man came from London to set up in a parish church nearby a monumental figure, and looked about for a skillful mason to assist him. Charles Summers was mentioned as the best hand in the neighborhood, and upon him the choice fell. Thus he was introduced to the world of art, for this figure had been executed by Henry Weeks, a distinguished London sculptor. The hardships of his childhood had made a man of him at this early age, a thoughtful and prudent man. Taking with him 10 of his 20 pounds, he went to London and applied for employment in the studio of Henry Weekes. This artist employed several men, but he had no vacant place except the humble one of stone polisher, which required little skill. He accepted the place with alacrity and delight at a salary of $5 a week. He was now in his element. The lowliest employment of the studio were pleasing to him. He loved to polish the marble. The sight of the numerous models was a pleasure to him. Even wetting the cloths and cleaning the model tools were pleasant tasks. His cheerfulness and industry soon made him a favorite, and when his work was done, he employed his leisure in gaining skill in carving and cutting marble. In this he had had such success that when in after life he became himself an artist, he would sometimes execute his idea in marble without modeling it in clay. When he had been in the studio about a year, his employer was commissioned to execute 2 colossal figures in bronze, and the young man was obliged to spend much of his time in erecting the foundry, and other duties which he felt to be foreign to his art. Impatient at this, he resigned his place and visited his home, where he executed medallion portraits, first of his own relations, and afterwards of public men, such as the mayor of Bristol and the member of Parliament for his county. These medallions gave him some reputation, and it was a favorite branch with him as long as he lived. Returning to London, he had no difficulty in gaining employment at good wages in a studio of a sculptor. Soon we find him competing for the prizes offered by the Royal Academy of London to young sculptors, the chief of which is a gold medal given every 2 years for the best group in clay of an historical character. A silver medal is also given every year for the best model from life. At the exhibition of 1851, when he was 24 years of age, he was a competitor for both these prizes. For the gold medal he executed a group which he called Mercy, interceding for the vanquished. For the silver medal he offered a bust of a living person. He had the singular good fortune of winning both, and he received them in public from the hands of the president of the Academy, Sir Charles Eastlake. Cheer upon cheer greeted the modest student when he rose and went forward for the purpose. He was a young man of great self-control. Instead of joining in the usual festivities of his fellow students after the award, he walked quietly to his lodgings, where his father and brother were anxiously awaiting to hear the result of the competition. He threw himself into a chair without a word, and they began to console him for the supposed disappointment. In a few minutes they sat down to supper, whereupon, with a knowing smile, he took his medals out of his pocket and laid one of them on each side of his plate. From this time he had no difficulties except those inherent in the nature of his work, and in his own constitution. His early struggle with life had made him too intense. He had scarcely known what play was, and he did not know how to recreate himself. He had little taste for reading or society. He loved art alone. The consequence was that he worked with an intensity and continuity that no human constitution could long endure. Soon after winning his 2 medals, his health was so completely prostrated that he made a voyage to Australia to visit a brother who had settled there. The voyage restored him, and he soon resumed the practice of his art at Melbourne. The people were just building their Houses of Parliament, and he was employed to execute the artistic work of the interior. He lived many years in Australia and filled the colony with his works in marble and bronze. In due time he made the tour of Europe and lingered 9 years in Rome, where he labored with suicidal assiduity. He did far more manual labor himself than is usual with artists of his standing, and yet during his residence in Rome he had 20 men in his service. It was in Rome in 1876 that he received from Melbourne the commission to execute in marble the 4 colossal statutes mentioned above. These works he completed in something less than 18 months, besides doing several other minor works previously ordered. It was too much, and nature resented the affront. After he had packed the statutes and sent them on their way to the other side of the globe, he set out for Melbourne himself, intending to take England by the way for medical advice. At Paris he visited the exhibition, and the next day at his hotel he fell senseless to the floor. In 3 weeks he was dead, at the age of 51 years, in the very midst of his career. For him, writes one of his friends, life consisted of but one thing, art. For that he lived, and almost in the midst of it died. He could not have conceived existence without it. Always and under every circumstance he was thinking of his work, and gathering from whatever surrounded him such information as he thought would prove of service. In omnibuses, in railway carriages, and elsewhere, he found opportunities of study, and could always reproduce a likeness from memory of the individuals so observed. I do not copy these words as commendation, but as warning. Like so many other gifted men of this age, he lived too fast, and attempted too much. He died when his greatness and best life would naturally have been just beginning. He died at the beginning of the period when the capacity for high enjoyment of life is naturally the greatest. He died when he could have ceased to be a manufacturer and become an artist. End of section 35. Recording by Theresa Sheridan.
Section 36 of Captains of Industry. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Captains of Industry by James Parton. Section 36. William B. Astor, House Owner. In estimating the character and merits of such a man as the late Mr. Astor, we are apt to leave out of view the enormous harm he might have done if he had chosen to do it. The rich fool who tosses $1 to a waiter for some trifling service, debases the waiter, injures himself, and wrongs the public. By acting in that manner in all the transactions of life, a rich man diffuses around him an atmosphere of corruption, and raises the scale of expense to a point which is oppressive to many, ruinous to some, and inconvenient to all. The late Mr. Astor, with an income from invested property of nearly $2 millions a year, could have made life more difficult than it was to the whole body of people in New York who were able to live in a liberal manner. He refrained from doing so. He paid for everything which he consumed the market price, no more, no less. And he made his purchases with prudence and forethought. As he lived for many years next door to the Astor Library, the frequenters of that noble institution had an opportunity of observing that he laid in his year's supply of coal in the month of June, when coal is cheapest. There was nothing which he so much abhorred as waste. It was both an instinct and a principle with him to avoid waste. He did not have the gas turned down low in a temporarily vacated room because he would save 2 cents by doing so, but because he justly regarded waste as wicked. His example in this particular, in a city so given to careless and ostentatious profusion as New York, was most useful. We needed such an example, nor did he appear to carry this principle to an extreme. He was very far from being miserly, though keenly intent upon accumulation. In the life of the Old World, there is nothing so shocking to a republicanized mind as the awful contrast between the abodes of the poor and the establishments of the rich. A magnificent park of 1,000 acres of the richest land set apart and walled in for the exclusive use of one family, while all about it are the squalid hovels of the peasants, to whom the use of a single acre to a family would be ease and comfort, is the most painful and shameful spectacle upon which the sun looks down this day. Nothing can make it right. It is monstrous. It curses equally the few who ride in the park and the many who look over its walls, for the great lord who can submit to be the agent of such injustice is as much its victim as the degraded laborer who drowns the sense of his misery in pot-house beer. The mere fact that the Lord can look upon such a scene and not stir to mend it is proof positive of a profound vulgarity. Nor is it lords alone who thus waste the hard-earned wealth of the toiling sons of men. I read some time ago of a wedding in Paris. A thriving banker there, who is styled the Baron Alphonse de Rothschild, having a daughter of 17 to marry, appears to have set seriously to work to find out how much money a wedding could be made to cost. In pursuing this inquiry, he caused the wedding festivals of Louis XIV's court, once so famous, to seem poverty-stricken and threadbare. He began by a burst of ostentatious charity. He subscribed money for the relief of the victims of recent inundations, and dowered a number of portionless girls, expending in these ways 250,000 francs. He gave his daughter a portion of 5 millions of francs. One of her painted fans cost 5,000 francs. He provided such enormous quantities of clothing for her little body that his house, if it had not been exceedingly large, would not have conveniently held them. For the conveyance of the wedding party from the house to the synagogue, he caused 25 magnificent carriages to be made, such as monarchs use when they are going to be crowned, and these vehicles were drawn by horses imported from England for the purpose. The bridal veil was composed of ineffable lace, made from an original design expressly for this bride. And then what doings in the synagogue! A choir of 110 trained voices, led by the best conductor in Europe, the first tenor of this generation engaged, who sang the prayer from Moses in Egypt. A crowd of rabbis and assistant rabbis, with the Grand Rabbi of Paris at their head. To complete the histrionic performance, 8 young girls, each bearing a beautiful gold-embroidered bag, and attended by a young gentleman, took up a collection for the poor, which yielded 7,000 francs. Mr. Astor could, if he had chosen, have thrown his millions about in this style. He was one of a score or two of men in North America who could have maintained establishments in town and country on the dastardly scale so common among rich people in Europe. He, too, could have had his park, his 6 mansions, his 30 carriages, his 100 horses, and his yacht as big as a man-of-war. That he was above such atrocious vulgarity as this was much to his credit and more to our advantage. What he could have done safely, other men would have attempted to whom the attempt would have been destruction. Some discredit also would have been cast upon those who live in moderate and modest ways. Every quarter day, Mr. Astor had nearly $500,000 to invest in the industries of the country. To invest his surplus income in the best and safest manner was the study of his life. His business was to take care of and increase his estate, and that being his business, he was right in giving the necessary attention to it. William will never make money, his father used to say, but he will take good care of what he has. And so it proved. The consequence was that all his life he invested money in the way that was at once best for himself and best for the country. No useless or premature scheme had had any encouragement from him. He invariably, and by a certainty of judgment that resembled an instinct, put his money where it would do most good. Political economists demonstrate that an investment which is the best for the investor must of necessity be the best for the public. Here again we were lucky. When we wanted houses more than we wanted coal, he built houses for us. And when we wanted coal more than we wanted houses, he set his money to digging coal, charging nothing for his trouble, but the mere cost of his subsistence. One fault he had as a public servant, for we may fairly regard in that light a man who wields so large a portion of our common estate. He was one of the most timid of men. He was even timorous. His timidity was constitutional and physical. He would take a great deal of trouble to avoid crossing a temporary bridge or scaffolding, though assured by an engineer that it was strong enough to bear 10 elephants. Nor can it be said that he was morally brave. Year after year he saw a gang of thieves in the city hall stealing his revenues under the name of taxes and assessments. But he never led an assault upon them, nor gave the aid he ought to those who did. Unless he is grossly belied, he preferred to compromise than fight, and did not always disdain to court the ruffians who plundered him. This was a grave fault. He who had the most immediate and the most obvious interest in exposing and resisting the scoundrels ought to have taken the lead in putting them down. This he could not do. Nature had denied him the qualities required for such a contest. He had his enormous estate, and he had mind enough to take care of it in ordinary ways, but he had nothing more. We must therefore praise him less for the good he did in his life than for the evil which he refrained from doing. End of section 36. Recording by Julia Kelley, Knoxville, Tennessee.
Section 37 of Captains of Industry. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Tomcho. Captains of Industry by James Parton. Section 37. Peter Cooper. On an April morning in 1883, I was seated at breakfast in a room which commanded a view of the tall flagstaff in Gramercy Park in the city of New York. I noticed some men unfolding the flag and raising it on the mast. The flag stopped midway and dropped motionless in the still spring morning. The newspapers which were scattered about the room made no mention of the death of any person of note, and yet this sign of mourning needed no explanation. For half a lifetime Peter Cooper had lived in a great, square, handsome house just round the corner, and the condition of the aged philanthropist had been reported about the neighborhood from hour to hour during the previous days, so that almost every one who saw the flag uttered words similar to those which I heard at the moment. He is gone, then. The good old man is gone. We shall never see his snowy locks again, nor his placid countenance, nor his old horse and gig jogging by. Peter Cooper is dead. He had breathed his last about 3 o'clock that morning, after the newspapers had gone to press, but the tidings spread with strange rapidity. When I went out of the house 2 hours later, the whole city seemed hung with flags at half-mast, for there is probably no city in the world which has so much patriotic bunting at command as New York. Passengers going north and west observed the same tokens of regard all along the lines of railroad. By midday the great state of New York, from the Narrows to the Lakes, and from the Lakes to the Pennsylvania line, exhibited everywhere the same mark of respect for the character of the departed. A tribute so sincere, so spontaneous, and so universal has seldom been paid to a private individual. It was richly deserved. Peter Cooper was a man quite out of the common order even of good men. His munificent gift to the public, so strikingly and widely useful, has somewhat veiled from public view his eminent executive qualities, which were only less exceptional than his moral. I once had the pleasure of hearing the story of his life related with some minuteness by a member of his own family, now honorably conspicuous in public life, and I will briefly repeat it here. More than 90 years ago, when John Jacob Astor kept a fur store in Water Street, and used to go round himself buying his furs of the Hudson River boatmen and the Western Indians, he had a neighbor who bought beaver skins of him, and made them into hats in a little shop near by, in the same street. This hat maker, despite his peaceful occupation, was called by his friends Captain Cooper, for he had been a good soldier of the Revolution, and had retired, after honorable service to the very end of the war, with a captain's rank. Captain Cooper was a better soldier than man of business. Indeed, New York was then a town of but 27,000 inhabitants, and the field for business was restricted. He was an amiable, not very energetic man, but he had had the good fortune to marry a woman who supplied all his deficiencies. The daughter of one of the colonial mayors of New York, she was born on the very spot which is now the site of St. Paul's Church, at the corner of Broadway and Fulton Street, and her memory ran back to the time when the stockade was still standing, which had been erected in the early day as a defense against the Indians. There is a vivid tradition in the surviving family of Peter Cooper of the admirable traits of his mother. She was educated among the Moravians in Pennsylvania, who have had particular success in forming and developing the female character. She was a woman in whom were blended the diverse qualities of her eminent son, energy and tenderness, mental force and moral elevation. She was the mother of 2 daughters and 7 sons, her 5th child being Peter, who was born in 1791. To the end of his life, Peter Cooper had a clear recollection of many interesting events which occurred before the beginning of the present century. "I remember," he used to say, "that I was about 9 years old at the time when Washington was buried. That is, he was buried at Mount Vernon, but we had a funeral service in Old St. Paul's. I stood in front of the church, and I recall the event well, on account of his old white horse and its trappings. A poor hatter, with a family of 9 children, must needs turn his children to account, and the consequence was that Peter Cooper enjoyed an education which gave him at least great manual dexterity. He learned how to use both his hands and a portion of his brain. He learned how to do things. His earliest recollection was his working for his father in pulling, picking, and cleaning the wool used in making hat bodies, and he was kept at this work during his whole boyhood, except that one year he went to school half of every day, learning a little arithmetic, as well as reading and writing. By the time he was 15 years old, he had learned to make a good beaver hat throughout, and a good beaver hat of that period was an elaborate and imposing structure. Then his father abandoned his hat shop and removed to Peekskill on the Hudson, where he set up a brewery, and where Peter learned the whole art and mystery of making beer. He was quick to learn every kind of work, and even as a boy he was apt to suggest improvements in tools and methods. At the age of 17 he was still working in the brewery, a poor man's son, and engaged in an employment which for many and good reasons he disliked. Brewing beer is a repulsive occupation. Then, with his father's consent, he came alone to New York, intending to apprentice himself to any trade that should fake his fancy. He visited shop after shop, and at last applied for employment at a carriage factory near the corner of Broadway and Chambers Street. He remembered, to his 90th year, the substance of the conversation which passed between him and one of the partners in this business. "Have you room for an apprentice?" asked Peter. "Do you know anything about the business?" was the rejoinder. The lad was obliged to answer that he did not. "Have you been brought up to work?" He replied by giving a brief history of his previous life. "Is your father willing that you should learn this trade?" "He has given me my choice of trades." "If I take you, will you stay with me and work out your time?" He gave his word that he would, and a bargain was made, $25 a year, and his board. He kept his promise and served out his time. To use his own language, "In my 17th year I entered an apprentice to the coach-making business, in which I remained 4 years, till I became of age. I made for my employer a machine for mortising the hubs of carriages, which proved very profitable to him, and was, perhaps, the first of its kind used in this country. When I was 21 years old, my employer offered to build me a shop and set me up in business, but as I always had a horror of being burdened with debt, and having no capital of my own, I declined his kind offer. He himself became a bankrupt. I have made it a rule to pay everything as I go. If, in the course of business, anything is due from me to any one, and the money is not called for, I make it my business, the last Saturday before Christmas, to take it to his business place." It was during this period of his life, from 17 to 21, that he felt most painfully the defects of his education. He had acquired manual skill, but he felt acutely that this quality alone was rather that of a beaver than of a man. He had an inquisitive, energetic understanding, which could not be content without knowledge far beyond that of the most advanced beaver. Hungering for such knowledge, he bought some books, but in those days there were few books of an elementary kind adapted to the needs of a lonely, uninstructed boy. His books puzzled more than they enlightened him, and so, when his work was done, he looked about the little bustling city to see if there was not some kind of evening school in which he could get the kind of help he needed. There was nothing of the kind, either in New York or in any city then. Nor were there free schools of any kind. He found a teacher, however, who, for a small compensation, gave him instruction in the evening in arithmetic and other branches. It was at this time that he formed the resolution which he carried out 45 years later. He said to himself, "If ever I prosper in business, so as to acquire more property than I need, I will try to found an institution in the city of New York, wherein apprentice boys and young mechanics shall have a chance to get knowledge in the evening." This purpose was not the dream of a sentimental youth. It was a clear and positive intention, which he kept steadily in view through all vicissitudes until he was able to enter upon its accomplishment. He was 21 years of age when the War of 1812 began, which closed for the time every carriage manufactory in the country. He was therefore fortunate in not having accepted the proposition of his employer. During the first months of the war, business was dead, but as the supply of foreign merchandise gave out, an impulse was given to home manufacture, especially of the fabrics used in clothing. There was a sudden demand for cloth-making machinery of all kinds, and now Peter Cooper put to good use his inventive faculty. He contrived a machine for cutting away the nap on the surface of cloth, which answered so well that he soon had a bustling shop for making the machines, which he sold faster than he could produce. He found himself all at once in an excellent business, and in December 1813 he married Miss Sarah Bedell of Hempstead, Long Island, he being then 22 and she 21. There never was a happier marriage than this. To old age he never sat near her without holding her hand in his. He never spoke to her nor of her without some tender epithet. He attributed the great happiness of his life and most of his success to her admirable qualities. He used to say that she was the day star, the solace, and the inspiration of his life. She seconded every good impulse of his benevolence, and made the fulfillment of his great scheme possible by her wise and resolute economy. They began their married life on a scale of extreme frugality, both laboring together for the common good of the family. "In early life," he used to say, "when I was first married, I found it necessary to rock the cradle, while my wife prepared our frugal meals. This was not always convenient in my busy life, and I conceived the idea of making a cradle that would be made to rock by mechanism. I did so, and enlarging upon my first idea, I arranged the mechanism for keeping off the flies and playing a music box for the amusement of the baby. This cradle was bought of me afterwards by a delighted peddler, who gave me his whole stock in trade, for the exchange and the privilege of selling the patent in the state of Connecticut. This device, in various forms and modifications, is still familiar in our households. They had 6 children, of whom 2 survive, Mr. Edward Cooper, recently mayor of New York, and Sarah, wife of Hon. Abram S. Hewitt, member of Congress from the city of New York. For nearly 65 years this couple lived together in happy marriage. In 1815 the peace with Great Britain, which gave such ecstasies of joy to the whole country, ruined Peter Cooper's business, as it was no longer possible to make cloth in the United States with profit. With 3 trades at his finger ends, he now tried a 4th, cabinet making, in which he did not succeed. He moved out of town and bought the stock of a grocer whose store stood on the very site of the present Cooper Institute, at that time surrounded by fields and vacant lots. But even then he thought that, by the time he was ready to begin his evening school, that angle of land would probably be an excellent central spot on which to build it. He did very well with his grocery store, but it never would have enabled him to endow his institute. One day, when he had kept his grocery about a year, and used his new cradle at intervals in the rooms above, an old friend of his accosted him, as he stood at the door of the grocery. "I have been building," said his visitor, "a glue factory for my son, but I don't think that either he or I can make it pay. But you are the very man to do it." "I'll go and see it," said Peter Cooper. He got into his friend's wagon, and they drove to the spot, which was near the corner of Madison Avenue and 29th Street, almost on the very spot now occupied by an edifice of much note called the Little Church Round the Corner. He liked the look of the new factory, and he saw no reason why the people of New York should send all the way to Russia for good glue. His friend asked $2,000 for the establishment as it stood, and Peter Cooper chanced to have that sum of money, and no more. He bought the factory on the spot, sold his grocery soon, and plunged into the manufacture of glue, which he knew nothing except that Russian glue was very good and American very bad. Now he studied the composition of glue, and gradually learned the secret of making the best possible article which brought the highest price in the market. He worked for 20 years without a bookkeeper, clerk, salesman, or agent. He rose with the dawn. When his men came at 7 o'clock to work, they found the factory fires lighted, and it was the master who had lighted them. He watched closely and always the boiling of his glue, and at midday, when the critical operation was over, he drove into the city and went the round of his customers, selling them glue and isinglass, and passed the evening in posting his books and reading to his family. He developed the glue business until it yielded him a profit of $30,000 a year. He soon began to feel himself a capitalist, and to count the years until he would be able to begin the erection of the institution he had in his mind. But men who are known to have capital are continually solicited to embark in enterprises, and he was under a strong temptation to yield to such solicitations, for the scheme which he had projected would involve a larger expenditure than could be ordinarily made from one business in one lifetime. He used to tell the story of his getting into the business of making iron, which was finally a source of great profit to him. "In 1828," he would say, "I bought 3,000 acres of land within the city limits of Baltimore for $105,000. When I first purchased the property, it was in the midst of a great excitement created by a promise of the rapid completion of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which had been commenced by a subscription of $5 per share. In the course of the first year's operations they had spent more than the $5 per share. But the road had to make so many short turns in going around points of rocks that they found they could not complete the road without a much larger sum than they had supposed would be necessary, while the many short turns in the road seemed to render it entirely useless for locomotive purposes. The principal stockholders had become so discouraged that they said they would not pay any more, and would lose all they had already paid in. After conversing with them, I told them that if they would hold on a little while, I would put a small locomotive on the road, which I thought would demonstrate the practicability of using steam engines on the road, even with all the short turns in it. I got up a small engine for that purpose, and put it upon the road, and invited the stockholders to witness the experiment. After a good deal of trouble and difficulty in accomplishing the work, the stockholders came, and 36 men were taken into a car, and, with 6 men on the locomotive, which carried its own fuel and water, and having to go uphill 18 feet to a mile, and turn all the short turns around the points of rocks, we succeeded in making the 13 miles on the first passage out in 1 hour and 12 minutes, and we returned from Ellicott's Mills to Baltimore in 57 minutes. This locomotive was to demonstrate that cars could be drawn around short curves, beyond anything believed at that time to be possible. The success of this locomotive also answered the question of the possibility of building railroads in a country scarce of capital, and with immense stretches of very rough country to pass, in order to connect commercial centers without the deep cuts, the tunneling and leveling which short curves might avoid. My contrivance saved the road from bankruptcy. He still had his tract of Baltimore land upon his hands, which the check to the prosperity of the city rendered for the time almost valueless. So he determined to build ironworks upon it, and a rolling mill. In his zeal to acquire knowledge at first hand, he had a narrow escape from destruction in Baltimore. In my efforts to make iron, he said, I had to begin by burning the wood growing upon the spot into charcoal. And in order to do that, I erected large kilns, 25 feet in diameter, 12 feet high, circular in form, hooped around with iron at the top, arched over so as to make a tight place in which to put the wood, with single bricks left out in different places in order to smother the fire out when the wood was sufficiently burned. After having burned the coal in one of these kilns perfectly, and believing the fire entirely smothered out, we attempted to take the coal out of the kiln, but when we had got it about half-way out, the coal itself took fire, and the men, after carrying water some time to extinguish it, gave up in despair. I then went myself to the door of the kiln to see if anything more could be done, and just as I entered the door the gas itself took fire and enveloped me in a sheet of flame. I had to run some 10 feet to get out, and in doing so my eyebrows and whiskers were burned, and my fur hat was scorched down to the body of the fur. How I escaped I know not. I seemed to be literally blown out by the explosion, and I narrowly escaped with my life. The ironworks were finally removed to Trenton, New Jersey, where to this day, under the vigorous management of Mr. Hewitt and his partners, they are very successful. During these active years, Peter Cooper never for a moment lost sight of the great object of his life. We have a new proof of this, if proof were needed, in the autobiography recently published of the eloquent Orville Dewey, pastor of the Unitarian Church of the Messiah, which Peter Cooper attended for many years. There were 2 men, says Dr. Dewey, who came to our church, whose coming seemed to be by chance, but was of great interest to me, for I valued them greatly. They were Peter Cooper and Joseph Curtis. Footnote 2, a noted philanthropist of that day, devoted to the improvement of the public schools of the city. End of footnote. Neither of them then belonged to any religious society, or regularly attended any church. They happened to be walking down Broadway one Sunday evening as the congregation were entering Stuyvesant Hall, where we then temporarily worshipped, and they said, "Let us go in here and see what this is." When they came out, as they both told me, they said to one another, "This is the place for us," and they immediately connected themselves with the congregation to be among its most valued members. Peter Cooper was even then meditating that plan of a grand educational institute which he afterwards carried out. He was engaged in a large and successful business, and his one idea, which he often discussed with me, was to obtain the means of building that institute. A man of the gentlest nature and the simplest habits, yet his religious nature was his most remarkable quality. It seemed to breathe through his life, as fresh and tender as if it were in some holy retreat instead of a life of business. Indeed, there are several aged New Yorkers who can well remember hearing Mr. Cooper speak of his project at that period. After 40 years of successful business life, he found, upon estimating his resources, that he possessed about $700,000 over and above the capital invested in his glue and iron works. Already he had become the owner of portions of the ground he had selected so long ago for the site of his school. The first lot he bought, as Mr. Hewitt informs me, about 30 years before he began to build, and from that time onward he continued to buy pieces of the ground as often as they were for sale, if he could spare the money, until, in 1854, the whole block was his own. At first his intention was merely to establish and endow just such an evening school as he had felt the need of when he was an apprentice boy in New York. But long before he was ready to begin, there were free evening schools as well as day schools in every ward of the city, and he therefore resolved to found something, he knew not what, which should impart to apprentices and young mechanics a knowledge of the arts and sciences underlying the ordinary trades, such as drawing, chemistry, mechanics, and various branches of natural philosophy. While he was revolving this scheme in his mind, he happened to meet in the street a highly accomplished physician who had just returned from a tour in Europe, and who began at once to describe in glowing words the Polytechnic School of Paris, wherein mechanics and engineers receive the instruction which their professions require. The doctor said that young men came from all parts of France and lived on dry bread just to attend the Polytechnic. He was no longer in doubt. He entered at once upon the realization of his project. Beginning to build in 1854, he erected a massive structure of brick, stone, and iron, 6 stories in height and fireproof in every part, at a cost of $700,000, the savings of his lifetime up to that period. 5 years after, he delivered the complete structure, with the hearty consent of his wife, his children, and his son-in-law, into the hands of trustees, thus placing it beyond his own control forever. 2,000 pupils at once applied for admission. From that day to this, the Institute has continued from year to year to enlarge its scope and improve its methods. Mr. Cooper added something every year to its resources, until his entire gift to the public amounted to about $2 millions. Peter Cooper lived to the great age of 92. No face in New York was more familiar to the people, and surely none was so welcome to them as the benign, placid, beaming countenance of old Peter Cooper. The roughest cartman, the most reckless hack driver would draw up his horses and wait without a word of impatience if it was Peter Cooper's quaint old gig that blocked the way. He was one of the most uniformly happy persons I have ever met, and he retained his cheerfulness to the very end. Being asked one day in his 90th year how he had preserved so well his bodily and mental vigor, he replied, "I always find something to keep me busy, and to be doing something for the good of man, or to keep the wheels in motion, is the best medicine one can take. I run up and down stairs here almost as easily as I did years ago, when I never expected that my term would run into the 90s. I have occasional twinges from the nervous shock and physical injury sustained from an explosion that occurred while I was conducting some experiments with nitrogen gas years ago. In other respects my days pass as painlessly as they did when I was a boy carrying a grocer's basket about the streets. It is very curious, but somehow, though I have none of the pains and troubles that old men talk about, I have not the same luxury of life, the same relish in the mere act of living, that I had then. Ages like babyhood come back again in a certain way. Even the memories of baby life come back, the tricks, the the pranks, the boyish dreams, the things that I did not remember at 40 or 50 years old, I recollect vividly now. But a boy of 90 and a boy of 9 are very different things, none the less. I never felt better in my life except for twinges occasioned by my nitrogen experiment. But still I hear a voice calling to me, as my mother often did when I was a boy. "Peter, Peter, it is about bedtime." And I have an old man's presentiment that I shall be taken soon. He loved the institute he had founded to the last hour of his consciousness. A few weeks before his death he said to Reverend Robert Collyer, "I would be glad to have 4 more years of life given me, for I am anxious to make some additional improvements in Cooper Union, and then part of my life work would be complete. If I could only live 4 years longer, I would die content." Dr. Collyer adds this pleasing anecdote. "I remember a talk I had with him not long before his death, in which he said that a Presbyterian minister of great reputation and ability, but who has since died, had called upon him one day, and among other things discussed the future life. They were old and tried friends, the minister and Mr. Cooper, and when the clergyman began to question Mr. Cooper's belief, he said, 'I sometimes think that if one has too good a time here below, there is less reason for him to go to heaven. I have had a very good time, but I know poor creatures whose lives have been spent in a constant struggle for existence. They should have some reward hereafter. They have worked here, they should be rewarded after death. The only doubts that I have about the future are whether I have not had too good a time on earth.'" He died in April, 1883, from a severe cold which he had not the strength to throw off. His end was as peaceful and painless as his life had been innocent and beneficial. End of Section 37. Recording by William Tomcho. Section 38 of Captains of Industry. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Tomcho. Captains of Industry by James Parton. Section 38. Paris-Duverney, French financier. Someone has remarked that the old French monarchy was a despotism tempered by epigrams. I take the liberty of adding that if the despotism of the later French kings had not been frequently tempered by something more effectual than epigrams, it would not have lasted as long as it did. What tempered and saved it was, that occasionally, by hook or by crook, men of sterling sense and ability rose from the ordinary walks of life to positions of influence and power, which enabled them to counteract the folly of the ruling class. About the year 1691 there was an inn at the foot of the Alps, near the border line that divided France from Switzerland, bearing the sign St. Francis of the Mountain. There was no village near. The inn stood alone among the mountains, being supported in part by travelers going from France to Geneva, and in part by the sale of wine to the farmers who lived in the neighborhood. The landlord, named Paris, was a man of intelligence and ability, who, besides keeping his inn, cultivated a farm. Assisted in both by energetic, capable sons, of whom he had 4, Antoine, aged 23, Claude, 21, Joseph, 7, and Jean, an infant. It was a strong, able family, who loved and confided in one another, having no thought but to live and die near the spot upon which they were born, and in about the same sphere of life. But such was not their destiny. An intrigue of the French ministry drew these 4 sons from obscurity and led them to the high places of the world. Pontchartrain, whose name is still borne by a lake in Louisiana, was then Minister of Finance to Louis XIV. To facilitate the movements of the army in the war then going on between France and Savoy, he proposed to the king the formation of a company which should contract to supply the army with provisions, and the king accepting his suggestion, the company was formed and began operations. But the Secretary of War took this movement of his colleague in high dudgeon, as the supply of the army, he thought, belonged to the War Department. To frustrate and disgrace the new company of contractors, he ordered the army destined to operate in Italy to take the field on the 1st of May, several weeks before it was possible for the contractors, by the ordinary methods, to collect and move the requisite supplies. The company explained the impossibility of their feeding the army so early in the season, but the Minister of War, not ill pleased to see his rival embarrassed, held to his purpose, and informed the contractor's agent that he must have 30,000 sacks of flour at a certain post by a certain day, or his head should answer it. The agent, alarmed and at his wits' end, consulted the innkeeper of the Alps, whom he knew to be an energetic spirit, and perfectly well acquainted with the men, the animals, the resources, and the roads of the region in which he lived, and through which the provisions would have to pass. The elder sons of the landlord were in the field at the time at work, and he told the agent he must wait a few hours till he could talk the matter over with them. At the close of the day there was a family consultation, and the result was that they undertook the task. Antoine, the eldest son, went to Lyons, the nearest large city, and induced the magistrates to lend the king the grain preserved in the public depositories against famine, engaging to replace it as soon as the navigation opened in the spring. The magistrates, full of zeal for the king's service, yielded willingly, and meanwhile Claude, the second of the brothers, bought 1,000 mules, and in a very few days, in spite of the rigour of the season, long lines of mules, each laden with a sack of flour, were winding their way through the defiles of the Alps, guided by peasants whom the father of these boys had selected. This operation being insufficient, hundreds of labourers were set to work breaking the ice in the night, and in constructing barges, so as to be in readiness the moment navigation was practicable. Early in the spring 200 barge loads were set floating down toward the seat of war, and by the time the general in command was ready to take the field, there was an abundance of tents, provisions, ammunition, and artillery within easy reach. The innkeeper and his sons were liberally recompensed, and their talents thus being made known to the company of contractors, they were employed again a year or two after in collecting the means required in a siege, and in forwarding provisions to a province threatened with famine. These large operations gave the brothers a certain distaste for their country life, and they removed to Paris in quest of a more stirring and brilliant career than an Alpine inn with farm adjacent could afford. One of them enlisted at first in the King's Guards, and the rest obtained clerkships in the office of the company of contractors. By the time they were all grown to manhood, the eldest, a man over 40, and the youngest, 18 or 20, they had themselves become army contractors and capitalists, noted in army circles for the tact, the fidelity, and the indomitable energy with which they carried on their business. The reader is aware that during the last years of the reign of Louis XIV, France suffered a series of most disastrous defeats from the allied armies, commanded by the great English general, the Duke of Marlborough. It was these four able brothers who supplied the French army with provisions during that terrible time, and I do not hesitate to say that on 2 or 3 critical occasions it was their energy and intelligence that saved the independence of their country. Often the king's government could not give them a single louis d'or in money when a famishing army was to be supplied. On several occasions they spent their whole capital in the work and risked their credit. There was one period of 5 months, as they used afterwards to say, when they never once went to bed, sure of being able to feed the army the next day. During those years of trial they were sustained in a great degree by the confidence which they inspired in their honesty as well as in their ability. The great French banker and capitalist then was Samuel Bernard. On more than one occasion Bernard saved them by lending them, on their personal security, immense sums, in one crisis as much as 3,000,000 francs. We can judge of the extent of their operations when we learn that during the last 2 years of the war they had to supply 180,000 men in the field, and 20,000 men in garrison, while receiving from the government little besides depreciated paper. Peace came at last, and it came at a moment when the whole capital of the four brothers was in the king's paper, and when the finances were in a state of inconceivable confusion. The old king died in 1715, leaving as heir to the throne a sickly boy 5 years of age. The royal paper was so much depreciated that the king's promise to pay 100 francs sold in the street for 25 francs. Then came the Scotch inflator, John Law, who gave France a brief delirium of paper prosperity, ending with the most woeful and widespread collapse ever known. It was these four brothers, but especially the third brother, Joseph Paris, known in French history as Paris-Duverney, who, by labors almost without example, restored the finances of the country, funded the debt at a reasonable interest, and enabled France to profit by the 20 years of peace that lay before her. There is nothing in the whole history of France more remarkable than the 5 years' labors of these brothers after the law mania of 1719, and it is hardly possible to overstate the value of their services at a time when the kingdom was governed by an idle and dissolute regent, and when there was not a nobleman about the court capable of grappling with the situation. The regent died of his debaucheries in the midst of their work. The Duke of Bourbon succeeded him. He was governed by Madame de Prie, and between them they concocted a nice scheme for getting the young king married, who had then reached the mature age of 15. The idea was to rule the king through a queen of their own choosing, and who would be grateful to them for her elevation. But it turned out quite otherwise. The king, indeed, was married, and he was very fond of his wife, and she tried to carry out the desires of those who had made her Queen of France. But there was an obstacle in the way, and that obstacle was the king's unbounded confidence in his tutor, the Abbé de Fleury, a serene and extremely agreeable old gentleman past 70. A struggle arose between the old tutor and Madame de Prie for the possession of the young king. The tutor won the victory. The Duke of Bourbon was exiled to his country seat, and Madame de Prie was sent packing. Paris-Duverney and his first clerk were put into the Bastille, where they were detained for 2 years in unusually rigorous imprisonment, and his 3 brothers were exiled to their native province. Another intrigue of court set them free again, and the 4 brothers were once more in Paris, where they continued their career as bankers, contractors, and capitalists as long as they lived, each of them acquiring and leaving a colossal fortune, which their heirs were considerate enough to dissipate. It was Paris-Duverney who suggested and managed the great military school at Paris, which still exists. It was he also who helped make the fortunes of the most celebrated literary men of the time, Voltaire and Beaumarchais. He did this by admitting them to a share in army contracts, one of which yielded Voltaire a profit of 700,000 francs, which, with good nursing, made him at last the richest literary man that ever lived. Paris-Duverney was as good a man and patriot as a man could well be who had to work with and under such persons as Louis XV. And Madame de Pompadour. By way of showing what difficulties men had to overcome who then desired to serve their country, I will mention a single incident of his later career. His favorite work, the École Militaire, of which he was the first superintendent, shared the unpopularity of its early patron, Madame de Pompadour, and long he strove in vain to bring it into favor. To use a narrative of Monsieur de Loménie, the biographer of Beaumarchais, he was constantly at court, laboring without cessation on behalf of the military school, and soliciting the king in vain to visit it in state, which would have given a sort of prestige. Coldly received by the Dauphin, the Queen, and the princesses, he could not, as the friend of Madame de Pompadour, obtain from the nonchalance of Louis XV. The visit which he so much desired, when the idea struck him, in his despair, of having recourse to the young harpist, who appeared to be so assiduous in his attendance on the princesses, and who directed their concert every week. Beaumarchais understood at once the advantage he might derive from rendering an important service to a clever, rich old financier, who had still a number of affairs in hand, and who was capable of bringing him both wealth and advancement. But how could a musician without importance hope to obtain from the king what had already been refused to solicitations of much more influence than his own? Beaumarchais went to work like a man who had a genius for dramatic intrigue and a knowledge of the human heart. We have shown that, while he was giving his time and attention to the princesses, he never asked for anything in return. He thought that if he were fortunate enough to persuade them, in the first instance, to pay a visit to the École Militaire, the curiosity of the king perhaps would be excited by the narrative of what they had seen, and would lead him to do that which he would never have been prompted to do by justice. He accordingly represented to the princesses not only the equitable side of the question, but also the immense interest which he himself had in obtaining this favour for a man who might be of great use to him. The princesses consented to visit the École Militaire, and Beaumarchais was granted the honour of accompanying them. The director received them with great splendour. They did not conceal from him the great interest they took in their young protégé, and some days afterward Louis XV, urged by his daughters, visited it himself, and thus gratified the wishes of old Duverney. From this moment the Financier, grateful for Beaumarchais' good services, and delighted to find a person who could assist him as an intermediary in his intercourse with the court, resolved to make the young man's fortune. He began by giving him a share in one of his speculations to the amount of 60,000 francs, on which he paid him interest at the rate of 10 per cent. After this he gave him an interest in various other affairs. He initiated me, says Beaumarchais, into the secrets of finance, of which, as everyone knows, he was a consummate master. Such was government in the good old times. I like to think of it when things go amiss in Washington or Albany. Let our rulers do as badly as they may, they cannot do worse than the rulers of the world did a century and a half ago. If any good or great thing was done in those days, it was done in spite of the government. End of Section 38. Recording by William Tomcho. Section 39 of Captains of Industry. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Tomcho. Captains of Industry by James Parton. Section 39. Sir Rowland Hill. The poet Coleridge, on one of his long walks among the English lakes, stopped at a roadside inn for dinner, and while he was there the letter carrier came in, bringing a letter for the girl who was waiting upon him. The postage was a shilling, nearly 25 cents. She looked long and lovingly at the letter, holding it in her hand, and then gave it back to the man, telling him that she could not afford to pay the postage. Coleridge at once offered the shilling, which the girl, after much hesitation, accepted. When the carrier was gone, she told him that he had thrown his shilling away, for the pretended letter was only a blank sheet of paper. On the outside there were some small marks which she had carefully noted before giving the letter back to the carrier. Those marks were the letter, which was from her brother, with whom she had agreed upon a shorthand system by which to communicate news without expense. "We are so poor," said she to the poet, "that we have invented this manner of corresponding and sending our letters free." The shilling which the postman demanded was, in fact, about a week's wages to a girl in her condition 50 years ago. Nor was it poor girls only who then played tricks upon the post office. Envelopes franked by honourable members of Parliament were a common article of merchandise, for it was the practice of their clerks and servants to procure and sell them. Indeed, the postal laws were so generally evaded that, in some large towns, the department was cheated of 3/4 of its revenue. Who can wonder at it? It costs more then to send a letter from one end of London to the other, or from New York to Harlem, than it now does to send a letter from Egypt to San Francisco. The worst effect of dear postage was the obstacles it placed in the way of correspondence between poor families who were separated by distance. It made correspondence next to impossible between poor people in Europe and their relations in America. Think of an Irish laborer who earned 6 pence a day, paying 75 cents to get news from a daughter in Cincinnati. It required the savings of 3 or 4 months. The man who changed all this, Sir Rowland Hill, died only 3 years ago at the age of 83. I have often said that an American ought to have invented the new postal system, and Rowland Hill, though born and reared in England and descended from a long line of English ancestors, was very much an American. He was educated on the American plan. His mind was American, and he had the American way of looking at things with a view to improving them. His father was a Birmingham schoolmaster, a free trader, and more than half a Republican. He brought up his 6 sons and 2 daughters to use their minds and their tongues. His eldest son, the Recorder of Birmingham, once wrote of his father thus: "Perhaps the greatest obligation we owe our father is this, that from infancy he would reason with us, and so observe all the rules of fair play that we put forth our little strength without fear. Arguments were taken at their just weight. The sword of authority was not thrown into the scale." Miss Edgeworth's tales deeply impressed the boy, and he made up his mind in childhood to follow the path which she recommended, and do something which should greatly benefit mankind. At the age of 11 he began to assist in teaching his father's pupils. At 12 he was a pupil no more, and gave himself wholly up to teaching. Long before he was of age, he had taken upon himself all the mere business of the school, and managed it so well as to pay off debts which had weighed heavily upon the family ever since he was born. At the same time he invented new methods of governing the school. He was one of the first to abolish corporal punishment. He converted his school into a republic governed by a constitution and code of laws, which filled a printed volume of more than 100 pages, which is still in the possession of his family. His school, we are told, was governed by it for many years. If a boy was accused of a fault, he had the right of being tried by a jury of his schoolfellows. Monitors were elected by the boys, and these monitors met to deliberate upon school matters as a little parliament. Upon looking back in old age upon this wonderful school, he doubted very much whether the plan was altogether good. The democratic idea, he thought, was carried too far. It made the boys too positive and argumentative. "I greatly doubt," said he once, "if I should send my own son to a school conducted on such a complicated system." It had, nevertheless, admirable features which he originated, and which are now generally adopted. Toward middle life he became tired of this laborious business, though he had the largest private school in that part of England. His health failed, and he felt the need of change and rest. Having now some leisure upon his hands, he began to invent and project. His attention was first called to the postal system merely by the high price of postage. It struck him as absurd that it should cost 13 pence to convey half an ounce of paper from London to Birmingham, while several pounds of merchandise could be carried for 6 pence. Upon studying the subject, he found that the mere carriage of a letter between 2 post offices cost scarcely anything, the chief expense being incurred at the post offices in starting and receiving it. He found that the actual cost of conveying a letter from London to Edinburgh, 404 miles, was 1/18th of a cent. This fact it was which led him to the admirable idea of the uniform rate of 1 penny for all distances. At that time a letter from London to Edinburgh was charged about 28 cents, but if it contained the smallest enclosure, even half a banknote or a strip of tissue paper, the postage was doubled. In short, the whole service was encumbered with absurdities, which no one noticed because they were old. In 1837, after an exhaustive study of the whole system, he published his pamphlet, entitled Post Office Reform, in which he suggested his improvements, and gave the reasons for them. The Post Office Department, of course, treated his suggestions with complete contempt. But the public took a different view of the matter. The press warmly advocated his reforms. The Thunderer of the London Times favoured them. Petitions poured into Parliament. Daniel O'Connell spoke in its favour. "Consider, my lord," said he to the Premier, "that a letter to Ireland, and the answer back, would cost thousands upon thousands of my poor and affectionate countrymen more than a fifth of their week's wages. If you shut the post office to them, which you do now, you shut out warm hearts and generous affections from home, kindred, and friends." The ministry yielded, and on January 10th, 1840, penny postage became the law of the British Empire. As the whole postal service had to be reorganized, the government offered Rowland Hill the task of introducing the new system, and proposed to give him £500 a year for 2 years. He spurned the proposal, and offered to do the work for nothing. He was then offered £1,500 a year for 2 years, and this he accepted rather than see his plan mismanaged by persons who did not believe in it. After many difficulties, the new system was set in motion, and was a triumphant success from the first year. A Tory ministry coming in, they had the incredible folly to dismiss the reformer, and he retired from the public service without reward. The English people are not accustomed to have their faithful servants treated in that manner, and there was a universal burst of indignation. A national testimonial was started. A public dinner was given him, at which he was presented with a check for $65,000. He was afterwards placed in charge of the Post Office Department, although with a lord over his head as nominal chief. The lord was a Tory of the old school, and wished to use the post office to reward political and personal friends. Rowland Hill said, "No, my lord, appointment and promotion for merit only." They quarrelled upon this point, and Rowland Hill resigned. The Queen sent a message to the House of Commons asking for £20,000 as a national gift to Sir Rowland Hill, which was granted, and he was also allowed to retire from office upon his full salary of £2,000 a year. That is the way to treat a public benefactor, and nations which treat their servants in that spirit are likely to be well served. The consequences of this postal reform are marvellous to think of. The year before the new plan was adopted in Great Britain, 106 millions of letters and papers were sent through the post office. Year before last, the number was 1,478 millions. In other words, the average number of letters per inhabitant has increased from 3 per annum to 32. The United States, which ought to have taken the lead in this matter, was not slow to follow, and every civilized country has since adopted the system. A few weeks before Sir Rowland Hill's death, the freedom of the City of London was presented to him in a gold box. He died in August, 1881, full of years and honors. End of section 39. Recording by William Tomcho. Section 40 of Captains of Industry. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Tomcho. Captains of Industry by James Parton, Section 40. Marie-Antoine Careme, French cook. Domestic servants occupy in France a somewhat more elevated position in the social scale than is accorded them in other countries. As a class, too, they are more intelligent, better educated, and more skillful than servants elsewhere. There are several works in the French language designed expressly for their instruction, some of the best of which were written, or professed to have been written, by servants. On the counter of a French bookstore you will sometimes see such works as the following: The Perfect Coachman, The Life of Jasmine, The Good Lackey, Rules for the Government of Shepherds and Shepherdesses by the Good Shepherd, The Well-Regulated Household, Duties of Servants of both sexes toward God and toward their masters and mistresses by a Servant, How to Train a Good Domestic. Some books of this kind are of considerable antiquity, and have assisted in forming several generations of domestic servants. One of them, it is said, entitled The Perfect Coachman, was written by a prince of the reigning house of France. In France, as in most old countries, few people expect to change their condition in life. Once a servant, always a servant. It is common for parents in humble life to apprentice their children to some branch of domestic service, satisfied if they become excellent in their vocation, and win at length the distinction and promotions which belong to it. Lady Morgan, who visited Paris several years ago, relates an anecdote or two showing how intelligent some French servants are. She was walking along the Quai Voltaire, followed by her French lackey, when he suddenly came to her side, and, pointing to a house, said, "There, madam, is a house consecrated to genius. There died Voltaire, in that apartment with the shutters closed. There died the first of our great men, perhaps also the last." On another occasion the same man objected to a note which she had written in the French language. "Is it not good French, then?" asked the lady. "Oh yes, madame," replied he, "the French is very good, but the style is too cold. You begin by saying, 'You regret that you cannot have the pleasure.' You should say, 'I am in despair.'" "Well then," said Lady Morgan, "write it yourself." "You may write it, if you please, my lady, at my dictation, for as to reading and writing they are branches of my education which were totally neglected." The lady remarks, however, that Paris servants can usually read very well, and that hackmen, water carriers, and porters may frequently be seen reading a classical author while waiting for a customer. A very remarkable case in point is Marie-Antoine Careme, whom a French writer styles "one of the princes of the culinary art." I suppose that no country in the world but France could produce such a character. Of this, however, the reader can judge when I have briefly told his story. He was born in a Paris garret in 1784, one of a family of 15 children, the offspring of a poor workman. As soon as he was old enough to render a little service, his father placed him as a garçon in a cheap and low restaurant, where he received nothing for his labor except his food. This was an humble beginning for a prince, but he improved his disadvantages to such a degree that, at the age of 20, he entered the kitchen of Talleyrand. Now Prince Talleyrand, besides being himself one of the daintiest men in Europe, had to entertain, as Minister of Foreign Affairs, the diplomatic corps, and a large number of other persons accustomed from their youth up to artistic cookery. Careme proved equal to the situation. Talleyrand's dinners were renowned throughout Europe and America. But this cook of genius, not satisfied with his attainments, took lessons in the art from Guipière, the renowned chef of the Emperor Napoleon, he who followed Murat into the wilds of Russia and perished with so many other cooks and heroes. Careme appears to have succeeded Guipière in the imperial kitchen, but he did not follow the Emperor to Elba. When the allied kings celebrated their triumph in Paris at a grand banquet, it was Careme who, as the French say, executed the repast. His brilliant success on this occasion was trumpeted over Europe, and after the final downfall of Napoleon he was invited to take charge of the kitchen of the English Prince Regent. At various times during his career he was cook to the Emperor Alexander of Russia, to the Emperor of Austria, to the Prince of Würtemberg, and to the head of the House of Rothschild. In the service of these illustrious eaters he gained large sums of money, which, however, he was very far from hoarding. In the maturity of his powers he devoted himself and his fortune to historical investigations concerning the art of cookery. For several years he was to be daily seen in the Imperial Library, studying the cookery, so renowned, of the ancient Greeks and Romans, desiring especially to know whether they possessed any secrets which had been lost. His conclusion was that the dishes served upon the tables of Lucullus, Augustus Caesar, and others, were utterly bad and atrociously stupid. But he commended the decoration of their tables, the cups and vases of gold, the beautiful pitchers, the chased silver, the candles of white Spanish wax, the fabrics of silk whiter than the snow, and the beautiful flowers with which their tables were covered. He published the results of his labors in a large octavo volume, illustrated by 128 engravings. He continued his studious labors, and published at various periods Ancient and Modern Cookery Compared, in 2 volumes, octavo, The Paris Cook, or the Art of Cooking in the 19th Century, and others. Toward the close of his life he wrote a magazine article upon Napoleon's way of eating at St. Helena. He dedicated one of his works to his great instructor and master in the art of cookery, Guipière. To give the reader an idea of his way of thinking and feeling, I will translate a few sentences of this dedication. Rise, illustrious shade, hear the voice of the man who was your admirer and your pupil. Your distinguished talents brought upon you hatred and persecution. By cabal you were obliged to leave your beautiful native land and go into Italy to serve a prince, Murat, to whose enjoyment you had once ministered in Paris. You followed your king into Russia, but, alas, by a deplorable fatality you perished miserably, your feet and body frozen by the frightful climate of the north. Arrived at Vilna, your generous prince lavished gold to save you, but in vain. O great Guipière, receive the public homage of a faithful disciple. Regardless of those who envied you, I wish to associate your name with my labors. I bequeath to your memory my most beautiful work. It will convey to future ages a knowledge of the elegance and splendor of the culinary art in the 19th century, and if Vatel rendered himself illustrious by a point of honor, dear to every man of merit, your unhappy end, O Guipière, renders you worthy of the same homage. It was that point of honor which made you follow your prince into Russia, when your gray hairs seemed to assure you a happier destiny in Paris. You shared the sad fate of our old veterans, and the honor of our warriors perishing of hunger and cold. All this, the reader will admit, is very strange and very French. In the same work, Careme chronicles the names of all the celebrated cooks who perished in the retreat from Russia. This prince of the kitchen died in 1833, when he was scarcely 50 years of age. His works are still well known in France, and some of them have passed through more than one edition. It is an odd contradiction that the name of this prince of the kitchen should be the French word for the time of fasting. Carême means Lent. End of Section 40. Recording by William Tomcho. Section 41 of Captains of Industry. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Tomcho. Captains of Industry by James Parton. Section 41. Wonderful Walker. I have here a good story for hard times. It is of a clergyman and cotton spinner of the Church of England, who, upon an income of £24 a year, lived very comfortably to the age of 94 years, reared a family of 8 children respectably, gave 2 of his sons a university education, and left an estate worth £2,000. Everyone will admit that this was a good deal to do upon a salary of $120. And some readers who find the winter hard to get through may be interested to know how he did it. To this day, though he has been dead 100 years, he is spoken of in the region where he lived as Wonderful Walker. By this epithet also he is spoken of by the poet Wordsworth in The Excursion. And him, the wonderful, our simple shepherds, speaking from the heart, deservedly have styled. He lived and died in the Lake Country of England, near the residence of Wordsworth, who has embalmed him in verse and described him in prose. Robert Walker, the youngest of 12 children, the son of a yeoman of small estate, was bred a scholar because he was of a frame too delicate, as his father thought, to earn his livelihood by bodily labor. He struggled into a competent knowledge of the classics and divinity, gained in strength as he advanced towards manhood, and by the time he was ordained was as vigorous and alert as most men of his age. After his ordination he had his choice of 2 curacies of the same revenue, namely, £5 a year, $25. One of these, Seathwaite by name, too insignificant a place to figure upon a map, or even in the Gazetteer, was situated in his native valley, in the church of which he had gone to school in his childhood. He chose Seathwaite, but not for that reason. He was in love, he wished to marry, and this parish had a small parsonage attached to it, with a garden of 3/4 of an acre. The person to whom he was engaged was a comely and intelligent domestic servant, such as then could frequently be found in the sequestered parts of England. She had saved, it appears, from her wages the handsome sum of £40. Thus provided, he married, and entered upon his curacy in his 26th year, and set up housekeeping in his little parsonage. Everyone knows what kind of families poor clergymen are apt to have. Wonderful Walker had one of that kind. About every 2 years, or less, a child arrived, and heartily welcome they all were, and deeply the parents mourned the loss of one that died. In the course of a few years, 8 bouncing girls and boys filled his little house, and the question recurs with force, how did he support them all? From Queen Anne's bounty and other sources his income was increased to the sum mentioned above, £24. That for a beginning. Now for the rest. In the first place, he was the lawyer of his parish, as well as its notary, conveyancer, appraiser, and arbitrator. He drew the wills, contracts, and deeds, charging for such services a moderate fee, which added to his little store of cash. His labors of this kind, at the beginning of the year, when most contracts were made, were often extremely severe, occupying sometimes half the night, or even all night. Then he made the most of his garden, which was tilled by his own hands until his children were old enough to help him. Upon the mountains near by, having a right of pasturage, he kept 2 cows and some sheep, which supply the family with all their milk and butter, nearly all their meat, and most of their clothes. He also rented 2 or 3 acres of land, upon which he raised various crops. In sheep shearing time he turned out and helped his neighbors shear their sheep, a kind of work in which he had eminent skill. As compensation, each farmer thus assisted gave him a fleece. In haying time, too, he and his boys were in the fields lending a hand, and got some good haycocks for their pains. Besides all this, he was the schoolmaster of the parish. Mr. Wordsworth positively says that, during most of the year, except when farm work was very pressing, he taught school 8 hours a day for 5 days in the week, and 4 hours on Saturday. The schoolroom was the church. The master's seat was inside the rails of the altar. He used the communion table for a desk, and there, during the whole day, while the children were learning and saying their lessons, he kept a spinning wheel in motion. In the evening, when school was over, feeling the need of exercise, he changed the small spinning wheel at which he had sat all day for a large one, which required the spinner to step to and fro. There was absolutely no waste and no luxury known in his house. The only indulgence which looked like luxury was that, on a Saturday afternoon, he would read a newspaper or a magazine. The clothes of the whole family were grown, spun, woven, and made by themselves. The fuel of the house, which was peat, was dug, dried, and carried by themselves. They made their own candles. Once a month a sheep was selected from their little flock and killed for the use of the family, and in the fall a cow would be salted and dried for the winter, the hide being tanned for family shoes. No house was more hospitable, nor any hand more generous than those of this excellent man. Old parishioners, who walked to church from a distance and wished to remain for the afternoon service, were always welcome to dinner at the parsonage, and sometimes these guests were so numerous that it took the family half the week to eat up the cold broken remains. He had something always to spare to make things decent and becoming. His sister's pew in the chapel he lined neatly with woolen cloth of his own making. "It is the only pew in the chapel so distinguished," writes the poet, "and I know of no other instance of his conformity to the delicate accommodations of modern times." 19 or 20 years elapsed before this singular and interesting man attracted any public notice. His parishioners, indeed, held him in great esteem, for he was one of those men who are not only virtuous, but who render virtue engaging and attractive. If they revered him as a benevolent, a wise, and a temperate man, they loved him as a cheerful, friendly, and genial soul. He was gay and merry at Christmas, and his goodness was of a kind which allures while it rebukes. But beyond the Vale of Seathwaite he was unknown until the year 1754, when the traveller discovered him and published an account of his way of life. "I found him," writes this traveller, "sitting at the head of a long square table, dressed in a coarse blue frock trimmed with black horn buttons, a checked shirt, a leathern strap about his neck for a stock, a coarse apron, a pair of great wooden-soled shoes, plated with iron to preserve them, with a child upon his knee, eating his breakfast. His wife and the remainder of his children were, some of them, employed in waiting upon each other, the rest in teasing and spinning wool, at which trade he is a great proficient, and moreover, when it is ready for sale, he will lay it upon his back, 16 or 32 pounds weight, and carry it on foot to the market, 7 or 8 miles. He spoke also of his cheerfulness, and the good humour which prevailed in the family, the simplicity of his doctrine, and the apostolic fervour of his preaching, for it seems he was an excellent preacher as well. The publication of his account drew attention to the extreme smallness of his clerical income, and the bishop offered to annex to Seathwaite an adjacent parish, which also yielded a revenue of £5 a year. By preaching at one church in the morning and the other in the afternoon, he could serve both parishes, and draw both stipends. Wonderful Walker declined the bishop's offer. The annexation, he wrote to the bishop, would be apt to cause a general discontent among the inhabitants of both places, by either thinking themselves slighted, being only served alternately, or neglected in the duty, or attributed it to covetousness, all of which occasions of murmuring I would willingly avoid. Mr. Wordsworth, to whom we are indebted for this letter, mentions that, in addition to his other gifts and graces, he had a beautiful handwriting. This admirable man continued to serve his little parish for nearly 68 years. His children grew up about him. 2 of his sons became clergymen of the Church of England. 1 learned the trade of a tanner. 4 of his daughters were happily married, and occasionally all the children and grandchildren, a great company of healthy and happy people, spent Christmas together, and went to church and partook of the communion together, this one family filling the whole altar. The good old wife died first. At her funeral, the venerable man, past 90 years of age, had the body borne to the grave by 3 of her daughters and 1 granddaughter. When the corpse was lifted, he insisted upon lending a hand, and he felt about, for he was almost blind, until he got hold of a cloth that was fastened to the coffin, and thus, as one of the bearers of the body, he entered the church where she was to be buried. The old man, who had preached with much vigor and great clearness until then, sensibly drooped after the loss of his wife. His voice faltered as he preached. He kept looking at the seat in which she had sat, where he had watched her kind and beautiful face for more than 60 years. He could not pass her grave without tears. But though sad and melancholy when alone, he resumed his cheerfulness and good humour when friends were about him. One night, in his 94th year, he tottered upon his daughter's arm, as his custom was, to the door, to look out for a moment upon the sky. "How clear," said he, "the moon shines to-night." In the course of that night he passed peacefully away. At 6 the next morning he was found dead upon the couch where his daughter had left him. Of all the men of whom I have ever read, this man, I think, was the most virtuous and the most fortunate. End of section 41. Recording by William Tomcho.
Section 42 of Captains of Industry. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Captains of Industry by James Parton. Section 42, Sir Christopher Wren. Of the out-of-door sights of London, none makes upon the stranger's mind so lasting an impression as huge St. Paul's, the great black dome of which often seems to hang over the city, poised and still, like a balloon in a calm, while the rest of the edifice is buried out of sight in the fog and smoke. The visitor is continually coming in sight of this dome, standing out in the clearest outline when all lower objects are obscure or hidden. Insensibly he forms a sort of attachment to it, at the expense of which the hardened old Londoner is amused, for he may have passed the building twice a day for 40 years without ever having had the curiosity to enter its doors, or even to cast a glance upward at its sublime proportions. It is the verdant American who is penetrated to the heart by these august triumphs of human skill and daring. It is we who, on going down into the crypt of St. Paul's, are so deeply moved at the inscription upon the tomb of the architect of the cathedral. Underneath is laid the builder of this church and city, Christopher Wren, who lived more than 90 years, not for himself, but for the public good. Reader, if you seek his monument, look around. The writer of this inscription, when he used the word circumspecie, which we translate look around, did not intend probably to confine the reader's attention to St. Paul's. Much of the old part of London is adorned by proofs of Wren's skill and taste, for it was he who rebuilt most of the churches and other public buildings which were destroyed by the Great Fire of London in 1666. He built or rebuilt 55 churches in London alone, besides 36 halls for the guilds and mechanics societies. The royal palaces of Hampton Court and Kensington were chiefly his work. He was the architect of Temple Bar, Drury Lane Theatre, the Royal Exchange, and the Monument. It was he who adapted the ancient palace at Greenwich to its present purpose, a retreat for old sailors. The beautiful city of Oxford, too, contains colleges and churches constructed or reconstructed by him. It is doubtful if any other man of his profession ever did so much work as he, and certainly none ever worked more faithfully. With all this, he was a self-taught architect. He was neither intended by his father to pursue that profession, nor did he ever receive instruction in it from an architect. He came of an old family of high rank in the Church of England, his father a clergyman richly provided with benefices, and his uncle being that famous Bishop of Ely, who was imprisoned in the Tower 18 years for his adherence to the royal cause in the time of the Commonwealth. He derived his love of architecture from his father, Dr. Christopher Wren, a mathematician, a musician, a draftsman, who liked to employ his leisure in repairing and decorating the churches under his charge. Dr. Wren had much mechanical skill and devised some new methods of supporting the roofs of large buildings. He was the ideal churchman, bland, dignified, scholarly, and ingenious. His son Christopher, born in 1631, the year after Boston was founded, inherited his father's propensities, with more than his father's talents. Like many other children destined to enjoy 90 years of happy life, he was of such delicate health as to require constant attention from all his family to prolong his existence. As the years went on, he became sufficiently robust, and passed through Westminster School to Oxford, where he was regarded as a prodigy of learning and ability. John Evelyn, who visited Oxford when Wren was a student there, speaks of visiting that miracle of a youth, Mr. Christopher Wren, nephew of the Bishop of Ely. He also mentions calling upon one of the professors, at whose home that prodigious young scholar, Mr. Christopher Wren, showed him a thermometer, a monstrous magnet, some dials, and a piece of white marble stained red, and many other curiosities, some of which were the young scholar's own work. There never had been such an interest before in science and invention. The work of Lord Bacon, in which he explained to the scholars of Europe the best way of discovering truth, by experiment, comparison, and observation, was beginning to bear fruit. A number of gentlemen at Oxford were accustomed to meet once a week at one another's houses for the purpose of making and reporting experiments, and thus accumulating the facts leading to the discovery of principles. This little social club, of which Christopher Wren was a most active and zealous member, grew afterwards into the famous Royal Society, of which Sir Isaac Newton was president, and to which he first communicated his most important discoveries. All subjects seem to have been discussed by the Oxford Club, except theology and politics, which were becoming a little too exciting for a philosophic treatment. Wren was in the fullest sympathy with the new scientific spirit, and during all the contention between king and parliament, he and his friends were quietly developing the science which was to change the face of the world, and finally make such wasteful wars impossible. A mere catalogue of Christopher Wren's conjectures, experiments, and inventions, made while he was an Oxford student, would more than fill the space I have at command. At the age of 24 he was offered a professorship of astronomy at Oxford, which he modestly declined as being above his age, but afterwards accepted. His own astronomy was sadly deficient, for he supposed the circumference of our earth to be 216,000 miles. This, however, was before Sir Isaac Newton had published the true astronomy, or had himself learned it. After a most honourable career as teacher of science at Oxford, he received from the restored king, Charles II, the appointment of assistant to the Surveyor General of Works, an office which placed him in charge of public buildings in course of construction. It made him, in due time, the Architect General of England, and it was in that capacity that he designed and superintended very many of the long series of works mentioned above. There never was a more economical appointment. The salary which he drew from the king appears to have been £200 a year, a sum equal perhaps to 4,000 of our present dollars. Such was the modest compensation of the great architect who rebuilt London after the Great Fire. That catastrophe occurred a few years after his appointment. The fire continued to rage for nearly 4 days, during which it destroyed 89 churches, including St. Paul's, 13,200 houses, and laid waste to 400 streets. Christopher Wren was then 35 years of age. He promptly exhibited to the king a plan for rebuilding the city, which proposed the widening and straightening of the old streets, suggested a broad highway along the bank of the river, an ample space about St. Paul's, and many other improvements which would have saved posterity a world of trouble and expense. The government of the dissolute Charles was neither wise enough nor strong enough to carry out the scheme, and Sir Christopher was obliged to content himself with a sorry compromise. The rest of his life was spent in rebuilding the public edifices, his chief work being the great cathedral. Upon that vast edifice he laboured for 35 years. When the first stone of it was laid, his son Christopher was a year old. It was that son, a man of 36, who placed the last stone of the lantern above the dome, in the presence of the architect, the master builder, and a number of masons. This was in the year 1710. Sir Christopher lived 13 years longer, withdrawn from active life in the country. Once a year, however, it was his custom to visit the city and sit for a while under the dome of the cathedral. He died peacefully while dozing in his armchair after dinner in 1723, aged 92 years, having lived one of the most interesting and victorious lives ever enjoyed by a mortal. If the people of London are proud of what was done by Sir Christopher Wren, they lament perhaps still more what he was not permitted to do. They are now attempting to execute some of his plans. Miss Lucy Phillimore, his biographer, says, Wren laid before the king and Parliament a model of the city as he proposed to build it, with full explanations of the details of the design. The street leading up Ludgate Hill, instead of being the confined, winding approach to St. Paul's that it now is, even its crooked picturesqueness marred by the viaduct that cuts all the lines of the cathedral, gradually widened as it approached St. Paul's, and divided itself into 2 great streets 90 feet wide at the least, which ran on either side of the cathedral, leaving a large open space in which it stood. Of the 2 streets, one ran parallel with the river until it reached the tower, and the other led to the exchange, which Wren meant to be the centre of the city, standing in a great piazza, to which 10 streets, each 60 feet wide, converged, and around which were placed the post office, the mint, the excise office, the goldsmith's hall, and the insurance, forming the outside of the piazza. The smallest streets were to be 30 feet wide, excluding all narrow, dark alleys without thoroughfares and courts. The churches were to occupy commanding positions along the principal thoroughfares, and to be "designed according to the best forms for capacity and bearing, adorned with useful porticos and lofty ornamental towers and steeples in the greater parishes. All churchyards, gardens, and unnecessary vacuities, and all trades that use great fires or yield noisome smells, to be placed out of town." He intended that the churchyards should be carefully planted and adorned, and be a sort of girdle around the town, wishing them to be an ornament to the city, and also a check upon its growth. To burials within the walls of the town he strongly objected, and the experience derived from the year of the plague confirmed his judgment. No gardens or squares are mentioned in the plan, for he had provided, as he thought, sufficiently for the healthiness of the town by his wide streets and numerous open spaces for markets. Gardening in towns was an art little considered in his day, and contemporary descriptions show us that vacuities were speedily filled with heaps of dust and refuse. The London bank of the Thames was to be lined with a broad quay, along which the halls of the city companies were to be built, with suitable warehouses in between for the merchants to vary the effect of the edifices. The little stream whose name survives in Fleet Street was to be brought to light, cleansed, and made serviceable as a canal 120 feet wide, running much in the line of the present Holborn Viaduct. These were the wise and large thoughts of a great citizen for the metropolis of his country, but the king was Charles II. Our race produces good citizens in great numbers, and great citizens not a few. But the supreme difficulty of civilization is to get a few such where they can direct and control. End of section 42.
Section 43 of Captains of Industry. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Captains of Industry by James Parton. Section 43. Sir John Rennie, Engineer. One of the most striking city scenes in the world is the view of London as you approach London Bridge in one of the small, low-decked steamers which ply upon the Thames. London stands where navigation for sea-going vessels ceases on this famous stream, which is crossed at London within a stretch of 3 or 4 miles by about 15 bridges, of which 7 or 8 can be seen at one view under the middle arch of London Bridge. Over all these bridges there is a ceaseless tide of human life, and in the river below, besides long lines of ships at anchor and unloading, there are as many steam vessels, barges, skiffs, and wherries as can find safe passage. A scene more animated, picturesque, and grand is nowhere else presented, especially when the great black dome of St. Paul's is visible, hanging over it, appearing to be suspended in the foggy atmosphere like a black balloon, the cathedral itself being invisible. 3 of these bridges were built by the engineers, father and son, whose name appears at the head of this article, and those 3 are among the most wonderful structures of their kind. One of these is London Bridge, another is called Southwark, and the third Waterloo. The time may come when the man who builds bridges will be as celebrated as the man who batters them down with cannon. But at present, for one person who knows the name of Sir John Rennie, there are 1,000 who are familiar with Wellington and Waterloo. He had, however, a pedigree longer than that of some lords. His father was a very great engineer before him, and that father acquired his training in practical mechanics under a Scotch firm of machinists and millwrights, which dates back to the reign of Charles II. It is to be particularly noted that both John Rennie the elder and Sir John, his son, derived an important part of their education in the workshop and model room. Both of them, indeed, had an ideal education, for they enjoyed the best theoretical instruction which their age and country could furnish, and the best practical training also. Theory and practice went hand in hand. While the intellect was nourished, the body was developed, the hand acquired skill, and the eyesight certainty. It is impossible to imagine a better education for a young man than for him to receive instruction at Edinburgh University under the illustrious Professor Black, and afterwards a training in practical mechanics under Andrew Meikle, one of the best mechanics then living. This was the fortunate lot of Rennie's father, who wisely determined that his son should have the same advantage. When the boy had passed through the preparatory schools, the question arose whether he should be sent to one of the universities or should go at once into the workshop. His father frequently said that the real foundation of civil engineering is mechanics, theoretical and practical. He did not believe that a young man could become an engineer by sitting in a classroom and hearing lectures, but that he must be placed in contact with realities, with materials, with tools, with men, with difficulties, make mistakes, achieve successes, and thus acquire the blended boldness and caution which mark the great men in this profession. It is a fact that the greatest engineers of the past century, whatever else they may have had or lacked, were thoroughly versed in practical mechanics. Smeaton, Telford, Arkwright, Hargreaves, George Stephenson, Rennie, were all men who, as they used to say, had an ounce of theory to a pound of practice. Young Rennie worked 8 hours a day in the practical part of his profession, and spent 4 in the acquisition of science and the modern languages, aided in both by the first men in London in their branches. 4 or 5 years of this training gave him, as he says in his Autobiography, the rudiments of his profession. His father next determined to give him some experience in bearing responsibility, and placed him as an assistant to the resident engineer at Waterloo Bridge, then in course of construction. He was but 19 years of age, but, being the son of the head of the firm, he was naturally deferred to and prepared to take the lead. Soon after, the Southwark Bridge was begun, which the young man superintended daily at every stage of its construction. English engineers regard this bridge as the ne plus ultra of bridge building. A recent writer speaks of it as confessedly unrivalled as regards its colossal proportions, its architectural effect, or the general simplicity and massive character of its details. It crosses the river by 3 arches, of which the central one has a span of 240 feet, and it is built at a place where the river at high tide is 36 feet deep. The cost of this bridge was $4 millions, and it required 5 years to build it. The bridge is of iron, and contains a great many devices originated by the young engineer, and sanctioned by his father. It was he also who first, in recent times, learned how to transport masses of stone of 25 tons weight, used for the foundation of bridges. Having thus become an accomplished engineer, his wise old father sent him on a long tour, which lasted more than 2 years, in the course of which he inspected all the great works, both of the ancients and moderns, in Europe and the more accessible parts of Africa and Asia. Returning home, the death of his father suddenly placed upon his shoulders the most extensive and difficult engineering business in Great Britain. But with such a training, under such a father, and inheriting so many traditional methods, he proved equal to the position, continued the great works begun by his father, and carried them on to successful completion. His father had already convinced the government that the old London Bridge could never be made sufficient for the traffic, or unobstructive to the navigation. A bridge has existed at this spot since the year 928, and some of the timbers of the original structure were still sound in 1824, when work upon the new bridge was begun. 30 firms competed for the contract for building the new London Bridge, but it was awarded to the Rennies, under whose superintendence it was built. The bridge is 928 feet in length, and has 5 arches. In this structure, although utility was the first consideration, there is an elegant solidity of design which makes it pleasing and impressive in the highest degree. The rapid stream is as little obstructed as the circumstances admitted, and there does not appear to be in the bridge an atom of superfluous material. London Bridge is, I suppose, the most crowded thoroughfare in the world. 25,000 vehicles cross it daily, as well as countless multitudes of foot passengers. So great is the throng that there is a project now on foot to widen it. In 1831, when it was formally opened by King William IV, the great engineer was knighted, and he was, in consequence, ever after called Sir John Rennie. During the period of railroad building, Sir John Rennie constructed a great many remarkable works, particularly in Portugal and Sweden. We have lately heard much of the disappointment of young engineers whom the cessation in the construction of railroads has thrown out of business. Perhaps no profession suffered more from the dull times than this. Sir John Rennie explains the matter in his Autobiography. In 1844, he tells us, the demand for engineering surveyors and assistants was very great. Engineering was considered to be the only profession where immense wealth and fame were to be acquired, and consequently everybody became engineers. It was not the question whether they were educated for it, or competent to undertake it, but simply whether any person chose to dub himself engineer. Hence lawyers' clerks, surgeons' apprentices, merchants, tradesmen, officers in the army and navy, private gentlemen, left their professions and became engineers. The consequence was that innumerable blunders were made, and vast sums of money were recklessly expended. It was much the same in the United States, and hence a good many of these gentlemen have been obliged to find their way back to the homelier occupations which they rashly abandoned. But in our modern world a thoroughly trained engineer, like Sir John Rennie, will always be in request, for man's conquest of the earth is still most incomplete, and I do not doubt that the next century will far outdo this in the magnitude of its engineering works, and in the external changes wrought by the happy union of theory and practice in such men as Telford, Stephenson, and Rennie. Sir John Rennie spent the last years of his life in writing his memoirs, a most interesting and useful work, recently published in London, which, I hope, will be republished here. It is just the book for a young fellow who has an ambition to gain honour by serving mankind in a skilful and manly way. Sir John Rennie, like his father before him, and like all other great masters of men, was constantly attentive to the interests and feelings of those who assisted him. He was a wise and considerate employer, and the consequence was that he was generally served with loyal and affectionate fidelity. He died in 1874, aged 80 years. End of section 43.
Section 44 of Captains of Industry. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Tomcho. Captains of Industry by James Parton. Section 44. Sir Moses Montefiore. We still deal strangely with the Jews. While at one end of Europe an Israelite scarcely dares show himself in the streets for fear of being stoned and abused, in other countries of the same continent we see them prime ministers, popular authors, favorite composers of music, capitalists, philanthropists, to whom whole nations pay homage. Sir Moses Montefiore, though an English baronet, is an Israelite of the Israelites, connected by marriage and business with the Rothschilds, and a sharer in their wonderful accumulations of money. His 100th birthday was celebrated in 1883 at his country house on the English coast, and celebrated in such a way as to make the festival one of the most interesting events of the year. The English papers tell us that nearly 100 telegrams of congratulation and benediction reached the aged man in the course of the day, from America, Africa, Asia, and all parts of Europe, from Christians, Jews, Mohammedans, and men of the world. The telegraph offices, we are told, were clogged during the morning with these messages, some of which were of great length, in foreign languages, and in strange alphabets, such as the Arabic and Hebrew. Friends in England sent him addresses in the English manner, several of which were beautifully written upon parchment and superbly mounted. The railroad passing near his house conveyed to him by every train during the day presents of rare fruit and beautiful flowers. The Jews in Spain and Portugal forwarded presents of the cakes prepared by Orthodox Jews for the religious festival which occurred on his birthday. Indeed, there has seldom been in Europe such a widespread and cordial recognition of the birthday of any private citizen. Doubtless, the remarkable longevity of Sir Moses had something to do with emphasizing the celebration. Great wealth, too, attracts the regard of mankind, but there are many rich old Jews in the world whose birthday excites no enthusiasm. The briefest review of the long life of Sir Moses Montefiore will sufficiently explain the almost universal recognition of the recent anniversary. He was born as long ago as 1784, the second year of American independence, when William Pitt was Prime Minister of England. He was 5 years old when the Bastille was stormed, and 31 when the Battle of Waterloo was fought. He was in middle life before England had become wise enough to make Jew and Christian equal before the law, and thus attract to her shores one of the most gifted and one of the most virtuous of races. The father of Sir Moses lived and died in one of the narrow old streets near the centre of London, called Philpot Lane, where he became the father of an old-fashioned family of 17 children. This prolific parent was a man of no great wealth, and consequently his eldest son Moses left school at an early age and was apprenticed to a London firm of provision dealers. He was a singularly handsome young man, of agreeable manners and most engaging disposition, circumstances which led to his entering the Stock Exchange. This was at a time when only 12 Jewish brokers were allowed to carry on business in London, and he was one of the 12. At the age of 28 he had fully entered upon his career, a broker and a married man. His wife, the daughter of Levi Cohen, a rich and highly cultivated Jewish merchant. His wife's sister had married N.M. Rothschild, and one of his brothers married Rothschild's sister. United thus by marriage to the great banker, he became also his partner in business, and this at a time when the gains of the Rothschilds were greatest and most rapid. Most readers remember how the Rothschilds made their prodigious profits during the last years of Bonaparte's reign. They had a pigeon express at Dover, by means of which they obtained the first correct news from the Continent. During the 100 Days, for example, such a panic prevailed in England that government bonds were greatly depressed. The first rumours from Waterloo were of defeat and disaster, which again reduced consols to a panic price. The Rothschilds, notified of the victory a few hours sooner than the government itself, bought largely of securities which, in 24 hours, almost doubled in value. Moses Montefiore, sharing in these transactions, found himself at 45 a millionaire. Instead of slaving away in business to the end of his life, adding million to million, with the risk of losing all at last, he took the wise resolution of retiring from business and devoting the rest of his life to works of philanthropy. When Queen Victoria came to the throne in 1837, Moses Montefiore was Sheriff of London. The Queen had lived near his country house, and had often, as a little girl, strolled about his park. She now enjoyed the satisfaction of conferring upon her neighbour the honour of knighthood, and a few years later she made him a baronet. Thus he became Sir Moses, which has an odd sound to it, but which in England seems natural enough. During the last 50 years Sir Moses has been, as it were, a professional philanthropist. Every good cause has shared his bounty, but he has been most generous to poor members of his own race and religion. He has visited 7 times the Holy Land, where the Jews have been for ages impoverished and degraded. He has directed his particular attention to improving the agriculture of Palestine, once so fertile and productive, and inducing the Jews to return to the cultivation of the soil. In that country he himself caused to be planted an immense garden, in which there are 900 fruit trees, made productive by irrigation. He has promoted the system of irrigation by building aqueducts, digging wells, and providing improved apparatus. He has also endowed hospitals and almshouses in that country. In whatever part of the world, during the last 50 years, the Jews have been persecuted or distressed, he has put forth the most efficient exertions for their relief, often going himself to distant countries to convey the requisite assistance. When he was 91 years of age, he went to Palestine upon an errand of benevolence. He has pleaded the cause of his persecuted brethren before the Emperor of Russia, and pleaded it with success. To all that part of the world known to us chiefly through the Jews, he has been a constant and most munificent benefactor during the last half-century, while never turning a deaf ear to the cry of want nearer home. In October he completes his 100th year. At present, January 1884, he reads without spectacles, hears well, stands nearly erect, although 6 feet 3 in height, and has nothing of the somnolence of old age. He drives out every day, gets up at 11 and goes to bed at 9. His diet is chiefly milk and old port wine, with occasionally a little soup or bread and butter. He still enjoys the delights of beneficence, which are among the keenest known to mortals, and pleases himself this year by giving cheques of £99 to benevolent objects, £1 for each year that he has had the happiness of living. End of section 44. Recording by William Tomcho.
Section 45 of Captains of Industry. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Captains of Industry by James Parton. Section 45. Marquis of Worcester, inventor of the steam engine. In the English county of Monmouthshire, near Wales, a region of coal mines and ironworks, there are the ruins of Raglan Castle, about a mile from a village of the same name. To these ruins let pilgrims repair who delight to visit places where great things began, for here once dwelt the Marquis of Worcester, who first made steam work for men. The same family still owns the site, as indeed it does the greater part of the county, the head of the family being now styled the Duke of Beaufort. The late Lord Raglan, commander of the English forces in the Crimea, belonged to this house, and showed excellent taste in selecting for his title a name so interesting. Perhaps, however, he never thought of the old tower of Raglan Castle, which is still marked and indented where the second Marquis of Worcester set up his steam engine 220 years ago. Very likely he had in mind the time when the first Marquis held the castle for Charles I against the Roundheads, and baffled them for 2 months, though he was then 85 years of age. It was the son of that valiant and tough old warrior who put steam into harness, and defaced his ancestral tower with a ponderous and imperfect engine. For many centuries before his time something had been known of the power of steam, and the Egyptians, a century or more before Christ, had even made certain steam toys, which we find described in a manuscript written about 120 B.C. at Alexandria, by a learned compiler and inventor named Hero. One of these was in the form of a man pouring from a cup a libation to the gods. The figure stood upon an altar, and it was connected by a pipe with a kettle of water underneath. On lighting a fire under the kettle, the water was forced up through the figure and flowed out of the cup upon the altar. Another toy was a revolving copper globe, which was kept in motion by the escape of steam from 2 little pipes bent in the same direction. Of this contrivance the French professor Arago once wrote, "This was beyond doubt a machine in which steam engendered motion, and could produce mechanical effects. It was a veritable steam engine." Let us hasten, however, to add that it bears no resemblance, either by its form or in mode of action, to steam engines now in use. Other steam devices are described by Hero. By one a horn was blown, and by another figures were made to dance upon an altar. But there is no trace in the ancient world of the application of steam to an important useful purpose. Professor Thurston of Hoboken in his excellent work upon the history of the steam engine, has gleaned from the literature of the last 700 years several interesting allusions to the nature and power of steam. In 1125 there was, it appears, at Rheims in France, some sort of contrivance for blowing a church organ by the aid of steam. There is an allusion also, in a French sermon of 1571, to the awful power in volcanic eruptions of a small quantity of confined steam. There are traces of steam being made to turn a spit upon which meat was roasted. An early French writer mentions the experiment of exploding a bombshell nearly filled with water by putting it into a fire. In 1630, King Charles I of England granted to David Ramsay a patent for 9 different contrivances, among which were the following: to raise water from low pits by fire; to make any sort of mills to go on standing waters by continual motion without help of wind, water, or horse; to make boats, ships, and barges to go against strong wind and tide; to raise water from mines and coal pits by a way never yet in use. This was in 1630, which was about the date of the Marquis of Worcester's engine. It is possible, however, that these devices existed only in the imagination of the inventor. The Marquis was then 29 years of age, and as he was curious in matters of science, it is highly probable that he was acquainted with this patent, and may have conversed with the inventor. It is strange how little we know of a man so important as the Marquis of Worcester in our modern industrial development. I believe that not one of the histories of England mentions him, and scarcely anything is known of the circumstances that led to his experimenting with steam. Living in a county of coal and iron mines, and his own property consisting very much in coal lands, his attention must of necessity have been called to the difficulties experienced by the miners in pumping the water from the deep mines. There were mines which employed as many as 500 horses in pumping out the water, and it was a thing of frequent occurrence for a productive mine to be abandoned because the whole revenue was absorbed in clearing it of water. This inventor was perhaps the man in England who had the greatest interest in the contrivance to which in early life he turned his mind. He was born in the year 1601, and sprung from a family whose title of nobility dated back to the 14th century. He is described by his English biographer as a learned, thoughtful, and studious Roman Catholic, as public-spirited and humane, as a mechanic, patient, skilful, full of resources, and quick to comprehend. He inherited a great estate, not perhaps so very productive in money, but of enormous intrinsic value. There is reason to believe that he began to experiment with steam soon after he came of age. He describes one of his experiments, probably of early date. "I have taken a piece of a whole cannon, whereof the end was burst, and filled it with water 3/4 full, stopping and screwing up the broken end, as also the touch hole, and making a constant fire under it. Within 24 hours it burst, and made a great crack." That the engine which he constructed was designed to pump water is shown by the very name which he gave it, the water commanding engine, and indeed it was never used for any other purpose. The plan of it was very simple, and without improvements it could have answered its purposes but imperfectly. It consisted of 2 vessels from which the air was driven alternately by the condensation of steam within them, and into the vacuum thus created the water rushed from the bottom of the mine. He probably had his first machine erected before 1630, when he was still a young man, and he spent his life in endeavours to bring his invention into use. In doing this he expended so large a portion of his fortune, and excited so much ridicule, that he died comparatively poor and friendless. I think it probable, however, that his poverty was due rather to the civil wars, in which his heroic old father and himself were so unfortunate as to be on the losing side. He attempted to form a company for the introduction of his machine, and when he died without having succeeded in this, his widow still persisted in the same object, though without success. He did, however, make several steam engines besides the one at Raglan Castle, engines which did actually answer the purpose of raising water from considerable depths in a continuous stream. He also erected near London a steam fountain, which he describes. During the next century several important improvements were made in the steam engine, but without rendering it anything like the useful agent which we now possess. When James Watt began to experiment, about the year 1760, in his little shop near the Glasgow University, the steam engine was still used only for pumping water, and he soon discovered that it wasted 3/4 of the steam. He once related to a friend how the idea of his great improvement, that of saving the waste by a condenser, occurred to his mind. He was then a poor mechanic living upon 14 shillings a week. "I had gone to take a walk," he said, "on a fine Sabbath afternoon. I had entered the green by the gate at the foot of Charlotte Street, and had passed the old washing house. I was thinking upon the engine at the time, and had gone as far as the herd's house, when the idea came into my mind that, as steam was an elastic body, it would rush into a vacuum, and, if a communication were made between the cylinder and an exhausted vessel, it would rush into it, and might be there condensed without cooling the cylinder." He had found it. Before he had crossed the green, he added, the whole thing was arranged in my mind. Since that memorable day the invention has been ever growing, for, as Professor Thurston well remarks, great inventions are never the work of any one mind. From Hero to Corliss is a stretch of nearly 20 centuries, during which probably 1,000 inventive minds have contributed to make the steam engine the exquisite thing it is today. End of section 45.
Section 46 of Captains of Industry. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Chenevert. Captains of Industry by James Parton. Section 46. An Old Dry Goods Merchant's Recollections. Our great cities have a great wonder of late years. I mean those immense dry goods stores which we see in Paris, London, New York, Vienna, Boston, Cincinnati, Chicago, in which are displayed under one roof almost all the things worn or used for domestic purposes by man, woman, or child. What a splendid and cheering spectacle the interior presents on a fine bright day! The counters a tossing sea of brilliant fabrics, crowds of ladies moving in all directions, the clerks, well dressed and polite, exhibiting their goods, the cash boys flying about with money in one hand and a bundle in the other, customers streaming in at every door, and customers passing out with the satisfied air of people who have got what they want. It gives the visitors a cheerful idea of abundance to see such a provision of comfortable and pleasant things brought from every quarter of the globe. An old dry goods merchant of London, now nearly 90, and long ago retired from business with a large fortune, has given his recollections of business in the good old times. There is a periodical called the Draper's Magazine devoted to the dry goods business, and it is in this that some months ago he told his story. When he was a few months past 13, being stout and large for his age, he was placed in a London dry goods store as boy of all work. No wages were given him. At that time the clerks in stores usually boarded with their employer. On the first night of his service, when it was time to go to bed, he was shown a low truckle bedstead under the counter, made to pull out and push in. He did not even have this poor bed to himself, but shared it with another boy in the store. On getting up in the morning, instead of washing and dressing for the day, he was obliged to put on some old clothes, take down the shutters of the store, which were so heavy he could hardly carry them, then clean the brass signs and the outside of the shop windows, leaving the inside to be washed by the older clerks. When he had done this, he was allowed to go upstairs, wash himself, dress for the day, and to eat his breakfast. Then he took his place behind the counter. We think it wrong for boys under 14 to work 10 hours a day, but in the stores of the olden time, both boys and men worked from 14 to 16 hours a day, and nothing was thought of it. This store, for example, was opened soon after 8 in the morning, and the shutters were not put up till 10 in the evening. There was much work to do after the store was closed, and the young men, in fact, were usually released from labor about 11:15. On Saturday nights the store closed at 12 o'clock, and it was not uncommon for the young men to be employed in putting away the goods until between 2 and 3 on Sunday morning. There used to be, the old gentleman records, a supper of hot beefsteaks and onions and porter, which we boys used to relish immensely, and eat and drink a good deal more of both than was good for us. After such a week's work, one would think the clerks would have required rest on Sunday, but they did not get much. The store was open from 8 until church time, which was then 11 o'clock, and this was one of the most profitable mornings of the week. The old gentleman explains why it was so. Almost all factories, shops, and stores were then kept open very late, and the last thing done in them was to pay wages, which was seldom accomplished until after midnight. Hence the apparent necessity for the Sunday morning's business. Another great evil mentioned by our chronicler grew out of this bad system of all work and no play. The clerks, released from business towards midnight, were accustomed to go to a tavern and spend part of the night in drinking and carousing, reeling home at a late hour, much the worse for drink, and unfit for business in the morning until they had taken another glass. All day the clerks were in the habit of slipping out without their hats to the nearest tap room for beer. Nor was the system very different in New York. An aged bookkeeper, to whom I gave an outline of the old gentleman's narrative, informs me that 40 years ago the clerks as a rule were detained till very late in the evening, and often went from the store straight to a drinking house. Now let us see how it fared with the public who depended upon these stores for their dry goods. From our old gentleman's account it would seem that every transaction was a sort of battle between the buyer and seller to see who should cheat the other. On the first day of his attendance he witnessed a specimen of the mode in which a dexterous clerk could sell an article to a lady which she did not want. An unskillful clerk had displayed too suddenly the entire stock of the goods of which she was in search, upon which she rose to leave, saying that there was nothing she liked. A more experienced salesman then stepped up. "Walk this way, madam, if you please, and I will show you something entirely different, with which I am sure you will be quite delighted." He took her to the other end of the store, then, going back to the pile which she had just rejected, snatched up several pieces and sold her one of them almost immediately. Customers, the old merchant says, were often bullied into buying things they did not want. "Many a half-frightened girl," he remarks, "have I seen go out of the shop, the tears welling up in her eyes, and saying, 'I am sure I shall never like it,' some shawl or dress having been forced upon her contrary to her taste or judgment." The new clerk, although by nature a very honest young fellow, soon became expert in all the tricks of the trade. It was the custom then for employers to allow clerks a reward for selling things that were particularly unsaleable, or which required some special skill or impudence in the seller. For example, they kept on hand a great supply of what they were pleased to call remnants, which were supposed to be sold very cheap, and as the public of that day had a passion for remnants, the master of the shop took care to have them made in sufficient numbers. There were heaps of remnants of linen, and it so happened that the remnants were exactly long enough for a shirt or some other garment. Any clerk who could push off one of these remnants upon a customer was allowed a penny or twopence as a reward for his talent, and there were certain costly articles, such as shawls and silks of unsaleable patterns, upon which there was a premium of several shillings for selling. There was one frightfully ugly shawl which had hung fire so long that the master of the shop offered a reward of 8 shillings ($2) to any one who could sell it at the full price, which was $20. Our lad covered himself with glory one morning by selling this horrid old thing. A sailor came in to buy a satin scarf for a present. The boy saw his chance. "As you want something for a present," said he to the sailor, "would you not like to give something really useful and valuable that would last for years?" In 3 minutes the sailor was walking out of the store, happy enough with the shawl under his arm, and the sharp youth was depositing the price thereof in the money drawer. Very soon he had an opportunity of assisting to gull the public on a great scale. His employer bought out the stock of an old-fashioned dry goods store in another part of the town for a small sum, upon which he determined to have a grand selling off. To this end he filled the old shop with all his old, faded, unsaleable goods, besides looking around among the wholesale houses and picking up several cartloads of cheap lots more or less damaged. The whole town was flooded with bills announcing the selling off of the old established store, at which many goods could be obtained at less than half the original cost. As this was then a comparatively new trick, the public were deceived by it, and it had the most astonishing success. The selling off lasted several weeks, the supply of goods being kept up by daily purchases. Our junior clerk was an apt learner in deception and trickery. Shortly after this experiment upon the public credulity, a careless boy, lighting the lamps in the window, for this was before the introduction of gas, set some netting on fire, causing a damage of a few shillings, the fire being almost instantly extinguished. As business had been a little dull, the junior clerk conceived the idea of turning the conflagration to account. Going up to his employer and pointing to the singed articles, he said to him, "Why not have a selling off here, and clear out all the stock damaged by fire?" The master laughed at the enormity of the joke, but instantly adopted the suggestion, and in the course of a day or two flaming posters announced the awful disaster and the sale. In preparation for this event, the clerk supplied lighted paper to the edges of whole stacks of goods, slightly discolored the tops of stockings, and in fact they singed to such an extent as almost to cause a real conflagration. During these night operations a great deal of beer was consumed, and the whole effect of the maneuver was injurious and demoralizing to every clerk in the store. This sale also was ridiculously successful. A mob surrounded the doors before they were opened, and to keep up the excitement some low-priced goods were ostentatiously sold much below cost. Such was the rush of customers that at noon the young men were exhausted by the labor of selling. The counters were a mere litter of tumbled dry goods, and the shop had to be closed for a while for rest and putting things in order. To keep up the excitement, the master and his favorite junior clerk rode about London in hackney coaches in search of any cheap lots that would answer their purpose. In the course of time this clerk, who was at heart an honest, well-principled fellow, grew ashamed of all this trickery and fraud. When at length he set up in business for himself, he adopted the principle of "one price and no abatement." He dealt honorably with all his customers, and thus founded one of the great dry goods houses of London. Two things saved him. First, he loathed drinking and debauchery. Secondly, he was in the habit of reading. The building up of the huge establishments, to which some persons object, has nearly put an end to the old system of guzzling, cheating, and lying. The clerks in these great stores go to business at 8 o'clock in the morning and leave at 6 in the evening, with an interval for dinner. They work all day in a clean and pleasant place, and they are neither required nor allowed to cheat or lie. A very large establishment must be conducted honestly, or it cannot long go on. Its very largeness compels an adherence to truth and fact. End of section 46. Recording by Phil Chenevert, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. End of Captains of Industry by James Parton.